Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown.
Growing up, I always thought my grandfather was a puzzle I'd never solve. He'd arrive at our house in his immaculate Lincoln Continental, wearing pressed suits that smelled of expensive cologne and pipe tobacco, his pockets heavy with crisp $100 bills that he'd slip into my hand with a wink. For college, he'd say, though I was barely 10 years old. But the moment I tried to hug him, thank him, tell him about school or friends or anything at all, his body would go rigid, his jaw would clench. Those pale blue eyes that had probably once sparkled with warmth would glaze over like ice forming on a winter pond, and he'd pat my shoulder with the mechanical affection of someone who'd forgotten how to be human. Mom would make excuses in that gentle way of hers, her voice dropping to a whisper as Grandpa retreated to the guest room, or the back porch, anywhere he could be alone. That's just his way, sweetheart. He grew up during the Great Depression. Times were different then. He had to be hard to survive. Dad would nod along, adding something about how Grandpa had built his construction company from nothing, how he dedicated every waking moment to providing for his family, how his business sense was sharper than a razor, but his social skills had atrophied from decades of disuse. I accepted these explanations because what choice did I have? I was a child who loved her grandfather despite not really knowing him, who treasured his generosity while nursing a quiet hurt that he couldn't seem to show me genuine affection. The money he gave me sat in a savings account, accumulating interest, a mathematical expression of a love he couldn't voice. When Grandpa died at 93, the funeral was standing room only. Contractors and business partners, old friends from his lodge, distant relatives I'd never met, they all came to pay respects. Person after person stood at the podium and spoke of his integrity, his work ethic, his quiet acts of charity that he'd never wanted publicized. An old man with gnarled hands wept as he described how Grandpa had paid for his daughter's cancer treatment. A woman I didn't recognize told us how Grandpa had given her late husband a job when no one else would, saving their family from homelessness. The stories painted a picture of a man who was far more complex than the distant grandfather I'd known, and I cried not just for his death but for all the years I'd spent not understanding him. The next morning, Dad found me in the kitchen, staring at my coffee. The house felt too quiet without the low murmur of mourners, the clink of dishes, the muted conversations about memories and legacies. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, running his hands through his graying hair in that way he did when he was working up to something difficult. "Your mother's gone to help clean out Grandpa's house," he said. "I thought maybe you and I could talk." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "About what?" "About your grandfather. About who he really was." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Would you like to know the truth?" The way he phrased it sent a spike of anxiety through my chest. Truth implied there had been lies, or at least careful omissions. My mind immediately went to dark places, hidden crimes, secret families, some shameful past that would taint all those golden memories people had shared yesterday. But Dad must have seen the fear in my face because he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "It's nothing like that," he said with a small, sad smile. "Nothing immoral or shameful, I promise. Your grandfather was a good man, but his life, his childhood—" He trailed off, looking past me toward the window where morning light was just beginning to filter through. "He made me promise not to tell you certain things until you were older, until you could understand. And I think you're old enough now." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I want to tell you the real story of how your grandfather became the man he was, why he was the way he was with you." Dad leaned back in his chair, his expression distant, as if he were looking back through decades. "It starts during the Depression, like your mom always said, but it's so much worse than you ever knew. In 1931, when the financial collapse had stripped away everything my great-grandfather had worked for, he made the decision that would alter the course of our family's history forever. His name was Ernest Whitmore, and before the crash he'd been a bank clerk in Denver, Colorado. A man of modest means with a wife named Catherine and 3 children. My grandfather Thomas, who was just 7 years old at the time, and his 2 younger sisters Dorothy and Helen. Ernest watched his savings evaporate overnight. The bank where he'd worked closed its doors, and thousands of people just like him found themselves destitute, standing in bread lines, selling apples on street corners, anything to survive. But Ernest had grown up on a farm in Kansas, and he knew how to work the land, how to hunt and trap and make do with nothing. So while other men jumped out of windows or drank themselves to death, Ernest loaded his family into their old Ford Model A and drove them up into the foothills of the Rockies. They traveled for 2 days on rough mountain roads, past abandoned mining camps and tiny settlements where people watched them pass with hollow, hungry eyes. Ernest had heard about unclaimed land in the high country, places where a man could stake out a homestead and live off what the wilderness provided. It was illegal, technically, but the government had bigger problems than squatters in the mountains, and the local rangers looked the other way as long as you didn't cause trouble. They found their spot in a dense forest of pine and aspen, miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a narrow dirt track that would become impassable in winter. The clearing Ernest chose had a small creek running through it, and the trees grew thick enough to provide lumber but open enough to let in sunlight for growing vegetables. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, the kind of beauty that could kill you if you weren't careful. My grandfather told my father that those first weeks were the hardest thing he'd ever experienced. Ernest and Thomas worked from dawn until dark, cutting down trees with a 2-man saw, their hands bleeding and blistered, their backs screaming in agony. They had to build the cabin before the first snow, and the work was brutal. Catherine and the girls gathered stones from the creek for the fireplace and chimney, while also trying to establish a garden in soil that was rocky and unforgiving. They ate salt pork and hardtack and whatever Thomas could catch in the creek with his bare hands. The cabin, when it was finally finished in late autumn, was small and crude. Just one room with a packed earth floor, a cast iron stove Ernest had salvaged from an abandoned homestead, and a fireplace with a chimney that Ernest built himself, having never done masonry work in his life. They had 3 beds crammed in there, one for the parents, one for Thomas, and one for the girls to share. Their clothes hung from pegs on the wall. A single shelf held their dishes and the few precious books Catherine had insisted on bringing. There was no running water, no electricity, no insulation beyond the mud they'd packed between the logs. When winter came, the cold was so intense that water in a cup left by Thomas's bed would freeze solid overnight. But they survived that first winter, and the ones after it. They trapped rabbits and hunted deer. Ernest set out a trap line for beaver and marten, selling the pelts for a few dollars at the trading post in Evergreen, a small town about 15 miles down the mountain. Catherine tended the garden and preserved everything they grew. The girls learned to sew and mend, to make soap from lye and animal fat, to stretch every resource until there was nothing left to stretch. And Thomas, my grandfather, learned that childhood as he'd known it was over. There would be no more school, no more friends, no more carefree days of play. At 7 years old, he became a worker, and work would define him for the rest of his life. Despite the hardship, my grandfather told my father that those years in the mountains weren't entirely without joy. There was a kind of peace in the simplicity of their existence, a rhythm to the days that became comfortable even if it was never easy. In the mornings, he'd wake to the smell of coffee and cornmeal mush cooking on the stove. He'd pull on his boots and head out with Ernest to check the traps, walking through forests so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat, watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks in shades of pink and gold. He learned to read animal tracks in the snow, to tell the difference between the print of a doe and a buck, to find where fish were hiding in the deep pools of the creek. He learned to move silently through the woods, to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder in it. Ernest taught him how to set snares, how to skin a rabbit without tearing the pelt, how to butcher a deer efficiently so nothing was wasted. These lessons were delivered in few words, Ernest not being a talkative man, but Thomas absorbed them all with the desperate intensity of someone who knew his family's survival depended on him remembering. The girls, Dorothy and Helen, helped Catherine with the endless domestic work that kept them alive. They hauled water from the creek, winter and summer, their small hands turning red and raw in the cold. They weeded the garden and scared off the deer that tried to eat their vegetables. They learned to knit and sew, repairing the same clothes over and over until they were more patched than original fabric. On rare evenings when everyone wasn't too exhausted to move, Catherine would read to them by candlelight from their precious books, the Bible, a volume of poetry, a tattered copy of Robinson Crusoe that took on new meaning in their isolated circumstances. Thomas remembered quiet moments, sitting by the creek with his sisters, all of them with their bare feet in the cold water, watching dragonflies skim the surface on summer afternoons, helping his mother hang laundry on a line strung between trees, the clothes snapping in the mountain wind. The first time he successfully shot a grouse with Ernest's old rifle, the pride that swelled in his chest when his father clasped his shoulder and gave him one of his rare smiles. The way the cabin smelled when Catherine baked bread. A scent so wonderful it made his stomach ache with hunger even after he'd already eaten. They saw other people rarely. Once every few months, Ernest would load up their mule, a stubborn, ill-tempered creature named Jasper with pelts, and ride down to Evergreen to trade. He'd return with flour, sugar, salt, ammunition, and whatever small luxuries he could afford, a stick of peppermint for the children to share, a tin of tobacco for himself, a packet of seeds for Catherine. These trips were events, and the family would gather around as Ernest unpacked his saddlebags, each item a treasure from the world they'd left behind. Occasionally they'd encounter other homesteaders, people like themselves who'd fled civilization for the mountains. There was an old widower named Hank, who lived about 5 miles to the west, who'd stop by once or twice a year to share news and have a meal. A family called the Johnsons had a place to the south, and sometimes Catherine and Mrs. Johnson would meet halfway between their properties to trade preserves or swap recipes written on precious scraps of paper. But for the most part, the Whitmores lived in isolation, a tiny island of humanity in a vast wilderness. Thomas told my father that he sometimes forgot what his own voice sounded like because he spoke so infrequently. Words became precious, not to be wasted. He communicated with his father in gestures and glances. Entire conversations held in silence as they worked side by side. This economy of speech, this habit of keeping his thoughts locked away, would stay with him for the rest of his life. The years passed. Thomas turned 8, then 9, then 10. He grew lean and strong, his hands developing calluses, his face weathering from constant exposure to sun and wind. Dorothy and Helen grew too, becoming capable workers who could do nearly any task their mother could. Ernest's beard went from brown to gray. Catherine's face developed deep lines around her eyes and mouth, the marks of constant worry and hard labor. The cabin's chinked logs settled. Its roof required patching. The vegetable patch expanded. They were making it work, carving out a life in a place that didn't want them. And then, on a cool evening in October of 1935, when Thomas was 11 years old, everything ended. It was just past sunset when Thomas heard the voices. They were eating dinner, venison stew with root vegetables from the garden, thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. The fire in the hearth crackled comfortably, and Catherine had been telling the girls a story about when she was young, growing up in St. Louis in a brick house with gas lamps and a piano in the parlor. Thomas was only half listening, tired from a long day of splitting wood, when Ernest suddenly went rigid. "Papa," Thomas said. Ernest held up his hand for silence, his head tilted toward the door. They all heard it then, men's voices outside, at least 3 or 4 of them, maybe more. They were laughing, the sound harsh and wrong in the peaceful mountain evening. Ernest Whitmore, one of them, called out, "We know you're in there, Ernie. Come on out, we just want to talk." Ernest's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with a fear Thomas had never seen in him before. Ernest was afraid of nothing. Not bears, not mountain lions, not the brutal winters that could kill a man in minutes if he got lost in a blizzard. But he was afraid now, and that terror transferred instantly to Thomas, making his heart pound and his hands shake. "Listen to me carefully," Ernest said in a low, urgent voice. He grabbed Catherine's arm. "Take the children out the back window. Right now. Run into the woods and don't stop running until you can't run anymore. Find somewhere to hide and stay there until morning." "Ernest," Catherine started, but he cut her off. "Now," he hissed. "There's no time. Go." "We ain't got all night, Ernie," another voice shouted. "Come on out and let's settle this like men." Ernest was already pushing them toward the back of the cabin, where a small window looked out onto the forest. He boosted Dorothy up first, then Helen, both girls starting to cry but trying to stay quiet. Catherine went next, struggling with her long skirt, and then it was Thomas's turn. "Take care of your mother and sisters," Ernest said, gripping Thomas's shoulders so hard it hurt. His eyes were bright with tears, which shocked Thomas more than anything else. He'd never seen his father cry. Be the man of the family now. "Can you do that?" "Papa, no," Thomas tried to say, but Ernest was already lifting him up to the window. "I love you, son," Ernest said. And then Thomas was outside in the cold night air, his mother grabbing his hand and pulling him away from the cabin. They ran. The girls were sobbing openly now, stumbling through the underbrush in the darkness. Catherine had one hand gripping Thomas's wrist and the other holding Helen's hand, dragging them deeper into the forest. Behind them, Thomas could hear the men at the cabin door, could hear his father shouting at them to stay back, to leave his family alone. Then came the sound of splintering wood as they broke through the door. Earnest screams started almost immediately. They were sounds Thomas had never heard a human being make, high and agonized, filled with a pain beyond comprehension. The men were laughing, whooping like they were at a party, and beneath it all was the wet, meaty sound of violence, of impacts against flesh, of things breaking. Thomas tried to turn back, tried to pull free from his mother's grip, but Catherine held on with desperate strength. "Don't look," she sobbed. "Don't look, don't stop, keep running." The screams went on and on. They echoed through the forest, bouncing off the mountains, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. Thomas had never imagined his strong, stoic father could make sounds like that. Never imagined any person could. It was the sound of a man being destroyed, and every second of it carved itself into Thomas's brain like knife wounds he knew would never heal. And then abruptly, the screaming stopped. In the terrible silence that followed, Thomas heard the men's voices again, fainter now with distance, but still audible on the still night air. They were arguing about something, their words indistinct. Then there was more laughter, the sound of hoofbeats, and gradually the noise faded away entirely. They kept running. Catherine led them deeper and deeper into the wilderness, away from the cabin, away from the horror behind them. They ran until Dorothy and Helen couldn't run anymore, and collapsed sobbing onto the forest floor. They ran until Thomas's lungs burned and his legs gave out. They ran until Catherine finally allowed them to stop in a thick grove of pine trees, where she gathered them all in her arms and held them as they cried. Thomas didn't cry. He couldn't. The shock had frozen something inside him, had turned his emotions into ice. He sat apart from his mother and sisters, his back against a tree, staring at nothing as his father's screams replayed in his head over and over, a horrible loop he couldn't escape. They spent the night huddled in those trees, jumping at every sound, terrified the men would come back to hunt them down. But dawn eventually came, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the same beautiful sunrise Thomas had watched 1,000 times before, except nothing would ever be beautiful again. They stayed in the forest for 2 days and 3 nights, moving periodically when they became too cold or too exposed, but never venturing back toward the cabin. Catherine was paralyzed with fear and grief, barely able to function, let alone make decisions. The girls clung to her, crying until they had no tears left, then falling into fitful sleep only to wake screaming from nightmares. Thomas found water for them to drink and managed to catch a fish in a stream using his hands, but they were all too traumatized to eat much. They were in shock, all of them, moving through the world like ghosts. On the morning of the 3rd day, Catherine finally spoke in a voice that sounded dead, emptied of everything that had made her human. "I have to go back. I have to see." "No, Mama," Dorothy pleaded. "Please don't." But Catherine was already standing, brushing pine needles off her torn and filthy dress. "You children wait here. Stay hidden. If I'm not back by nightfall," she paused, seeming to realize she had no plan for that contingency. What would 3 children do alone in the wilderness if their mother never returned? "I'll be back," she said instead. "I promise. Thomas, you're in charge until I return." Thomas watched her walk away through the trees, her figure growing smaller and smaller until she disappeared. Then he sat with his sisters and waited, the hours stretching out endlessly as the sun moved across the sky. He tried not to think about what his mother was going to find at the cabin, tried not to imagine what those men had done to his father, but his mind kept circling back to it. The screams, the terrible prolonged screams that had gone on forever. Catherine didn't return until late afternoon. When she finally appeared, she was covered in dirt, her hands bleeding, her dress stained with something dark that Thomas didn't want to identify. She was carrying a bundle wrapped in a blanket. Food, Thomas realized, and some clean clothes for them all. Her face was set in an expression of grim determination, but her eyes looked dead, like someone had reached inside and pulled out everything that mattered. "We can go back now," she said quietly. "It's safe." They followed her through the forest, Thomas's stomach churning with dread, not wanting to see what awaited them but unable to resist looking. When the cabin finally came into view, he was shocked by how normal it looked from the outside. The door hung crooked on its hinges, broken where the men had kicked it in, but otherwise the structure appeared intact. Maybe he'd imagined how bad it was, but then he saw the blood. It was everywhere around the entrance, soaked into the dirt in a dark stain that spread out in a terrible radius. The sight of it made Thomas's knees weak, made his vision swim. "Don't look," Catherine said sharply, stepping in front of him and blocking his view. "Your father isn't there anymore. I took care of him. I buried him properly, back in the trees where the ground was soft enough to dig. You don't need to see anything except that he's at peace now." Later, Thomas would understand what an enormous act of love and strength that had been, his mother dealing with the aftermath alone while protecting her children from the worst of it. In that moment, though, he just felt numb. Ernest was gone. That fact seemed impossible, incomprehensible. How could someone so vital and strong simply cease to exist? The cabin's interior had been cleaned, Thomas realized when they went inside. The blood was gone, mostly. Catherine had scrubbed the floor and walls, had straightened the overturned furniture, had done her best to erase the evidence of violence. But you could still see it if you knew to look. Darker patches on the floorboards where the wood had absorbed blood too deeply to be fully cleaned. Scratches on the walls from whatever struggle had occurred. A crack in the stovepipe where something or someone had been slammed into it. Their possessions had been ransacked. Drawers pulled open, contents spilled everywhere, their few valuables taken. The men had been looking for something, Thomas realized. This hadn't been random violence. They'd wanted something from Ernest, and when he wouldn't or couldn't give it to them, they'd killed him for it. That first night back in the cabin was the longest of Thomas's life. Every sound made him jump. The settling of logs, the wind in the trees, the hoot of an owl. He kept waiting for the men to come back, kept seeing their shadows moving past the windows in his imagination. He barely slept, and when he did, his father's screams echoed through his dreams. When morning came, Catherine sat them all down at the table. The same table where they'd been eating dinner when everything ended, and explained their new reality in a voice that shook but didn't break. "Your father is gone," she said. "We can't bring him back. But we have to survive. We have to keep living, keep working, keep going. Thomas, you're 11 years old, but you're the man of the house now. I need you to be strong, to help me take care of your sisters, to do the work your father did. Can you do that?" Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. Something had hardened inside him during those days in the forest, had calcified around his heart like a shell. The boy he'd been, the one who'd found joy in summer afternoons and fresh bread, and the pride in his father's eyes, that boy was gone. What remained was someone colder, someone who understood that the world was cruel and survival required you to be hard. "I can do it," he said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Older, flatter, dead. And so began the longest, hardest years of my grandfather's life. Thomas grew up overnight. At an age when other children were playing marbles and learning arithmetic, he was setting trap lines before dawn and returning home after dark, his hands raw and bleeding, his clothes soaked with the blood of animals he'd killed and cleaned. He did the work of a grown man with the body of a child, pushing himself past exhaustion every single day because stopping meant starving. Catherine did everything else. She maintained the garden, preserved food, repaired their clothes, kept the cabin as clean and orderly as possible. But grief had broken something fundamental in her, and she moved through these tasks like an automaton, her face expressionless, her eyes distant. She rarely spoke except to give Thomas instructions or to read to the girls from the Bible before bed, her voice a monotone recitation of psalms and proverbs that offered no comfort. Dorothy and Helen, 9 and 7 years old, tried to help, but they were so traumatized that they spent hours every day just sitting, staring at nothing, jumping violently at sudden sounds. Helen started wetting the bed again, and Dorothy developed a stutter that she'd battle for the rest of her life. They clung to each other constantly, two small ghosts haunting the cabin. Thomas had no time to process his own trauma. There was too much to do, too much responsibility pressing down on his narrow shoulders. He checked the traps, hunted when he could, fished in the creek until his hands were numb from the cold water. He chopped wood for the stove, repaired the cabin's leaking roof, dug a new latrine when the old one filled up. He did it all in grim silence, speaking only when necessary, his face set in lines too harsh for a child. The worst part was the constant fear. He couldn't forget what those men had done, couldn't stop wondering if they'd come back. Every time he heard horses on the distant trail, every time he saw strangers in Evergreen on his rare trips to town, his heart would start racing and his hands would shake. He slept with Ernest's old hunting knife under his pillow, and woke from nightmares of men breaking down the door, of his mother and sisters screaming as they were dragged into the darkness. The years crawled by. Thomas turned 12, then 13. He shot up in height, becoming gangly and awkward, all elbows and knees. His voice cracked and deepened. The soft roundness of childhood left his face, replaced by sharp angles and a jaw that was always clenched tight. He looked like his father, people said, and every time someone mentioned it, Thomas felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. When he was 13, an opportunity arose that would change everything. A construction company in Evergreen was hiring laborers to help build a new hotel, and they didn't ask questions about age as long as you could do the work. Thomas signed on, lying about being 16, and found himself working alongside grown men who cursed and spat tobacco and told crude jokes he pretended to understand. The work was brutal, mixing concrete, hauling lumber, digging foundation trenches in rocky soil. But it was also steady, and it paid real money instead of the meager few dollars he could make from selling pelts. Every week Thomas would bring home his wages and give them all to Catherine, who would immediately use most of it to buy flour and coffee and beans, the basics they couldn't produce themselves. For the first time since Ernest's death, they had enough to eat. Thomas acquired a mule for the commute, a stubborn beast named Chip, who had a personality somewhere between ornery and outright hostile. But Chip was reliable, and Thomas would ride him down the mountain every Monday before dawn and back up every Saturday evening, a 3-hour journey each way. During the week, he slept in a boarding house in Evergreen, sharing a room with 3 other workers in bunks that smelled of sweat and mildew. On the weekends, he'd return to the cabin and work from dawn to dusk, fixing everything that had broken during his absence, maintaining the trap lines, splitting enough wood to last the week. He had no friends, no social life, no time for anything except work. The other men at the construction site tried to include him at first, inviting him to the saloon after shifts or to poker games on Saturday nights. But Thomas always refused. He had nothing to say to them, no interest in their lives or their stories. All he cared about was earning money and keeping his family alive. Everything else was irrelevant. Catherine began to worry about him. She could see the way he was hardening, turning into something cold and distant, someone who moved through the world like a machine. She tried to talk to him about it, tried to get him to open up about his feelings, but Thomas would just look at her with those flat, dead eyes and say he was fine. Eventually, she stopped trying. The cabin continued to deteriorate. The chimney, which Ernest had built without proper knowledge or materials, began to show serious problems. Birds nested in it every summer, and the combination of their activity and the expansion and contraction from heating and cooling began to loosen the mortar and bricks. Every fall, Thomas would climb onto the roof and try to patch it, but he was fighting a losing battle against time and poor construction. The summer Thomas turned 17. The chimney started leaking smoke into the cabin, making them all cough and burning their eyes. He knew it needed serious repair, probably rebuilding entirely, but he didn't have the time or expertise. So he did what he could, stuffing rags into gaps, slathering on more mortar, and hoped it would hold one more winter. On his 18th birthday, which passed without acknowledgement or celebration because they'd long since stopped marking such things, Thomas decided to give the chimney one final thorough cleaning before the cold weather set in. It was early September, the aspen leaves just starting to turn gold, the morning air crisp with the promise of autumn. He climbed onto the roof with Ernest's old chimney brush, a tool they'd owned since the cabin was built, and began working the brush down the flue. The resistance was significant. Years of creosote and bird nests and accumulated debris. Thomas pushed harder, really forcing the brush down, and suddenly felt something give way. A brick, he realized with dismay, tumbling down into the fireplace with a crash that echoed through the cabin. "Everything okay up there?" Catherine called from inside. "Fine," Thomas shouted back, already climbing down. He'd have to reset the brick, probably mix new mortar, another project on the endless list of things that needed fixing. When he reached the fireplace and peered up into the chimney, he could see the gap where the brick had been, and sitting in the gap was something he hadn't expected. 3 cloth sacks, blackened with soot, stuffed into the space like someone had been hiding them. Thomas's heart started pounding as he reached up and carefully extracted the sacks. They were heavy, much heavier than they should be for their size. He carried them outside, away from his mother and sister's curious eyes, and found a quiet spot behind the cabin. With trembling hands, he opened the first sack. Gold coins spilled out into his palms, gleaming even under their coating of soot and age. Spanish doubloons, American eagles, coins from countries Thomas didn't even recognize. He opened the second sack, then the third, and found more of the same. There had to be hundreds of them, maybe thousands of dollars worth. Thomas sat there in the dirt behind the cabin, surrounded by more wealth than he'd ever imagined, and finally understood why his father had died. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Ernest must have found these coins somehow. Maybe discovered them in an abandoned mine. Maybe came across them in some other way during his exploration of the mountains, and someone knew he had them. Those men who came that night, they'd been looking for the gold, demanding Ernest tell them where it was hidden. When he refused, either out of stubbornness or because he wanted to protect his family's future, they tortured him, killed him, and ransacked the cabin looking for what they believed he'd stolen or found. But they'd never thought to check the chimney. Why would they? Who would hide a fortune in the one place that got used constantly, where extreme heat would damage any paper money, and smoke would blacken and tarnish everything? It was both a brilliant hiding place and a terrible one, and Ernest had probably planned to retrieve the gold someday when it was safe, when enough time had passed, except he'd never gotten that chance. Thomas sat with the coins for nearly an hour, his mind racing through the implications. This gold represented everything his family needed: food, security, maybe even a way out of the mountains and back to civilization. But it also represented his father's death, the worst night of Thomas's life, 4 years of back-breaking labor and constant fear. He could feel rage building in his chest, hot and overwhelming, anger at his father for hiding this and never telling anyone, anger at the men who'd killed him, anger at the unfairness of surviving in poverty while sitting on a fortune they'd never known existed. But beneath the rage was something else, a kind of grim determination. His father had died protecting this gold, had endured God knows what torture, rather than reveal its location. Ernest had been thinking about his family's future, even as he was being killed, had wanted this wealth to go to Catherine and the children, not to the murderers who destroyed their lives. And Thomas wasn't going to let his father's sacrifice be meaningless. He carefully repacked the coins into their sacks, making sure none fell out, then carried them into the cabin. Catherine was stirring a pot of beans on the stove. The girls were mending clothes by the window, and everyone looked up in surprise when Thomas came in and dumped the sacks on the table with a heavy thud. "Mama," he said quietly, "we need to talk." They spent the rest of the day planning. Catherine initially wanted to turn the gold in to the authorities, convinced that keeping it would be morally wrong, but Thomas argued forcefully against it. The gold had been hidden in their chimney for 4 years. Either it was Ernest's legitimately found legally on public land, or acquired through honest means, or it had been stolen, but if the latter was true, the real owners were either dead or had long since given up looking for it. Turning it in would just result in it being confiscated by the government while they got nothing, and Ernest had died protecting this wealth. They owed it to his memory to use it. Eventually, Catherine gave in. She was exhausted from 4 years of grinding poverty and constant fear, and the promise of security, of being able to feed her children without constantly worrying, was too tempting to resist. They would keep the gold, but they would be smart about it. They couldn't start spending it immediately, Thomas reasoned. That would raise too many questions. Would bring exactly the kind of attention they didn't want. Instead, they would move slowly, carefully. Thomas would continue working his construction job, but he'd start making connections, learning the business beyond just manual labor. He'd save his legitimate wages while gradually, carefully converting the gold coins through various dealers and shops in different towns, never too much at once, never in a way that would attract notice. It took them 3 years to fully convert and begin using the fortune. 3 more years of living in the cabin, of maintaining the fiction of poverty, while slowly, methodically building the foundation for something better. Thomas used the time to learn everything he could about construction, about business, about how money moved and how deals were made. He was patient. Those terrible years after his father's death had taught him patience, if nothing else. When Thomas finally made his move, buying land in Denver and starting his own construction company at age 21, people assumed he'd saved every penny from his wages and gotten lucky with a loan. No one questioned it. No one suspected that a young man who lived in a shabby boarding house and wore the same 3 shirts in rotation was actually sitting on a fortune in gold. The company grew. Thomas was a brutal, tireless worker who demanded the same from his employees. He underbid competitors, took on jobs others wouldn't touch, worked 18-hour days 7 days a week. Within 5 years, his company was one of the most successful in Denver. Within 10 years, he was wealthy beyond anything his childhood self could have imagined. He moved Catherine and his sisters to Denver as soon as he could, buying them a beautiful house with indoor plumbing and central heating and all the luxuries they'd been denied for so long. But Catherine never really recovered from what happened in the mountains. She lived another 20 years, comfortable and safe. But she remained emotionally distant, her mind stuck in that cabin, reliving that terrible night. When she finally died, Thomas told people she'd passed peacefully. But the truth was, she'd been dying slowly for decades. Dorothy and Helen adjusted better. They both married, had children, built lives that on the surface looked normal and happy. But Thomas noticed how they'd both married men who were aggressively, almost pathologically nonviolent, men who'd go out of their way to avoid any kind of conflict or confrontation. He noticed how they kept their homes like fortresses, with multiple locks and security systems. The trauma had shaped them just as it had shaped him, just in different ways. Thomas never married. He told people he was too busy with work, that building the company required all his attention. But the truth was simpler and sadder. He'd forgotten how to connect with people, how to be vulnerable, how to love. The walls he'd built around himself at age 11 had become so thick, so impenetrable, that no one could get through them. He had relationships with women over the years, brief affairs that never went anywhere because he couldn't open up, couldn't share himself. He'd sit across dinner tables from intelligent, beautiful women who clearly cared for him, and feel nothing. His emotions had been locked away so long he'd lost the key. When his employees talked about their lives, their families, their hopes and dreams, Thomas would nod politely but feel like he was listening to people speak a foreign language. He understood the words but couldn't grasp their meaning. What did it mean to live for the weekend? What was a hobby? Why would anyone waste time and energy on activities that didn't generate income or serve a practical purpose? His sisters worried about him constantly. They'd invite him to family dinners, trying to include him in their lives, but Thomas would sit stiffly in their comfortable living rooms, making awkward conversation about the weather and the business, clearly uncomfortable. Eventually, his visits became less frequent, then rare, then virtually non-existent except for major holidays he couldn't avoid. When his first grandchild was born, my father Thomas felt a confusing swirl of emotions he couldn't identify or express. He was happy for Dorothy, certainly, but looking at the baby made him think of his own childhood, of his sisters as small girls crying in the forest, of everything they'd lost. He'd buy extravagant gifts, the most expensive toys and clothes, desperately trying to express feelings he couldn't voice. But when anyone tried to thank him or show him affection, he'd freeze up, his body going rigid, his face becoming a mask. The pattern continued with his other grandchildren. He loved them fiercely, wanted the best for them, would have given them anything, but he couldn't show it in the ways that mattered. He couldn't hug them, couldn't tell them stories, couldn't be emotionally present. The wall was too high, too thick, built from too much trauma and too many years of repression. When I was born, something in Thomas shifted. My father told me later that I looked almost identical to Helen at the same age, the same dark curls, the same wide eyes, the same serious expression. And seeing me brought back memories Thomas had spent decades trying to suppress. Helen as a little girl, crying in the forest, asking when Papa was coming back. Helen traumatized and withdrawn, barely speaking for months after their father's death. Helen, who'd eventually grown up and found happiness but who'd never fully healed from what she'd experienced. Thomas looked at me and saw his sister, saw the child he'd failed to protect, the innocence he hadn't been able to preserve. It made him want to give me everything, to surround me with such wealth and security that I'd never know fear or hunger or loss. But it also made him terrified to get close, terrified that his presence would somehow taint me, that the darkness he carried would infect me. So he remained distant, showering me with gifts but unable to offer warmth, desperate to show love but trapped behind walls he'd spent a lifetime building. Every time I tried to hug him, he'd see Helen's face from that terrible night. Every time I smiled at him, he'd remember her tears. The resemblance that should have brought him joy instead brought him agony. My father finally told me all of this the day after Thomas's funeral, his voice breaking at several points as he described his grandfather's story, my great-grandfather's death, the years of suffering that had forged my grandfather into the man he became. As he talked, I cried for the grandfather I'd never truly known, for the little boy who'd heard his father's screams and spent the rest of his life running from them, for all the love he'd felt but couldn't express. He wanted you to know, my father said quietly. Before he died, he made me promise to tell you when you were old enough to understand. He said he was sorry for being distant, sorry he couldn't be the grandfather you deserved. He said to tell you that every gift he gave you, every dollar he put in your savings account, that was him trying to say I love you. It was the only way he knew how. I thought about the savings account that had grown over the years. Thought about all those crisp $100 bills pressed into my hand with a wink and a pat on the shoulder. I thought about my grandfather's uncomfortable silence, his rigid posture when I tried to hug him, the way his eyes would sometimes get distant when he looked at me, like he was seeing someone else from another time. And I understood, not just intellectually but deeply, in my bones. I understood the weight he'd carried, the walls he'd built, the ways trauma shapes us into people we never planned to be. I understood that love doesn't always look like warmth and affection, that sometimes it looks like a silent man who works himself to exhaustion to make sure his family never wants for anything. Sometimes it looks like distance maintained not from coldness but from fear of causing pain. Did he ever go back? I asked, to the cabin. My father shook his head. Not once. He sold the property years ago to the Forest Service. As far as I know, the cabin collapsed decades ago, reclaimed by the forest. He never wanted to see it again. We sat in silence for a long time, both of us processing the story, both of us thinking about the man we'd buried yesterday, the complicated, damaged, loving person who'd done his best with what he had. I forgive him, I said finally. I want you to know that. Whatever he thought he needed forgiveness for, whatever guilt he carried, I forgive him. I understand now. I understand everything. My father nodded, tears streaming down his face. I think, he said quietly, that's what he needed to hear most of all. That night, alone in my room, I took out my savings account statement and looked at the numbers representing years of my grandfather's silent love. The money had come from gold hidden in a chimney, had been paid for with Ernest's life and Thomas's childhood and Catherine's sanity and Dorothy and Helen's innocence. It was wealth built on tragedy, prosperity purchased with blood. But it was also a gift, freely given by a man who'd survived unimaginable trauma and still found the strength to build something beautiful from the ruins. My grandfather had taken the worst night of his life and transformed it into security for his family, had turned screams in the darkness into opportunity and hope. I kept the money, not because I needed it, but because refusing it would dishonor his sacrifice and his love. Instead, I used it the way he would have wanted, to build something meaningful, to help others, to ensure that the pain his father had endured and the childhood he'd sacrificed hadn't been for nothing. Wherever he is now, and I'd like to think he's somewhere, finally at peace, finally reunited with the father whose death shaped his entire life. I hope he knows I understand. I hope he knows I love him, not despite his coldness but including it, seeing it for what it was. Armor built by a traumatized child who never got the chance to heal. Rest in peace, Grandpa. Rest in peace, Ernest. May you both finally know the warmth and connection you were denied in life. And may the gold that cost so much finally, at last, mean something beyond suffering. It was one of those sweltering summer nights in late July 2018, the kind where the air feels heavy and thick, clinging to your skin like a damp cloth. I was 17 that summer, and our old two-story house had no central air conditioning, just a few window units that rattled and wheezed without doing much good. The upstairs had become unbearable, the heat collecting under the eaves until my bedroom felt like the inside of a furnace. I'd lie there, sheets kicked off, staring at the ceiling, and watching the shadows cast by the struggling fan, my t-shirt soaked through with sweat. That's when I started sleeping in the basement. The decision seemed practical at the time. Our basement was partially finished. My dad had done most of the work himself years ago, putting up drywall and laying down carpet remnants. It wasn't fancy, but it was functional. There was an old sectional couch that sagged in the middle, a coffee table scarred with water rings, and my PlayStation 4 hooked up to a decent-sized TV. The temperature down there stayed a good 15 degrees cooler than the rest of the house, and that made all the difference. The basement had one large window that looked out onto our backyard. It was one of those ground-level windows, the kind where you're looking up slightly at the grass line. During the day, it let in natural light and gave a view of our lawn, the weathered fence, and beyond that, the dense tree line that marked the beginning of the woods. Our property backed up to about 40 acres of forest, mostly oak and pine, with thick underbrush that made it nearly impossible to walk through without a path. I'd never thought much about that window before. It was just a window. But once I started spending my nights down there, I became acutely aware of it. Aware of how exposed it made me feel, how the darkness outside seemed to press against the glass like something alive. The first week was fine. I'd stay up late playing games or watching movies, eventually dozing off on the couch with the TV still on, the flickering light providing a kind of comfort. The basement felt like my own private space, away from my parents and my younger sister, away from the suffocating heat and the ordinary frustrations of teenage life. But then the howling started. At first, I barely noticed it. We'd always had coyotes in the area. Their yipping and howling were common sounds at night, especially in summer. They'd sing to each other across the hills, their voices carrying through the darkness in a chorus that was oddly beautiful if you weren't too close to it. This howl was different. It started on a Tuesday night, around 2 in the morning. I was half asleep, some action movie playing on the TV with the volume turned down low. The sound cut through my drowsy state like a knife. A long, low howl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. It wasn't the high-pitched yapping of coyotes. This was deeper, more resonant, almost mournful. It started low and rose slowly, sustaining for what felt like an impossibly long time before finally trailing off into silence. I sat up on the couch, suddenly wide awake, my heart beating a little faster. The sound had come from the woods behind our house. I was sure of it, but it didn't sound like any coyote I'd ever heard. There was something almost deliberate about it, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. I waited, listening. The TV continued its quiet dialogue. Explosions and gunfire rendered meaningless by the volume. Outside, through that window, I could see nothing but darkness and the vague shapes of trees against the slightly lighter sky. The howl came again, and this time I could swear it was closer. Still from the woods, but nearer to the edge of our property. That same low, sustained note that seemed to carry a weight of intention. I grabbed the remote and muted the TV, sitting in complete silence, straining to hear. Minutes passed. Nothing. Just the ordinary sounds of the house. The hum of the refrigerator upstairs. The tick of pipes cooling. The whisper of air through the vents. I convinced myself it was just an animal. Maybe a dog that had gotten loose from a neighboring property. We had a few farms scattered around the area, and it wouldn't be unheard of for a hunting dog to roam at night. The rational part of my brain offered these explanations, and I accepted them gratefully, turning the TV volume back up and settling into the couch. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake, certain I'd heard something. The basement suddenly felt less like a refuge and more like a trap, a space too far from my family, too isolated, too exposed to whatever was out there in the darkness beyond that window. The howling became a nightly occurrence. Always around the same time, between 2 and 3 in the morning, that long, low sound would drift through the darkness, and each night I became more convinced it was getting closer. What disturbed me most was the pattern. The sound would come from one direction, then seem to shift. One night it would be far to the left, near the old oak tree at the corner of our property. The next night it would be to the right, near where the fence line disappeared into the underbrush. Then it would be directly behind the house, so close that it seemed to be just beyond the window. I started keeping track in my phone, making notes about where the sound seemed to originate. I told myself I was being scientific about it, gathering data that I could present to my parents or maybe even call animal control. But really, I think I was just trying to exert some kind of control over a situation that made me feel increasingly helpless. The notes became obsessive. Tuesday, 2:15 a.m. Howl from northwest, near property line. Long duration, maybe 8 to 10 seconds. Wednesday, 2:30 a.m. Howl from southwest, closer. Lasted longer. Rusty was barking upstairs. Thursday, 2:10 a.m. Multiple howls. Started far, ended close. Sounded like it was moving. Friday, 2:45 a.m. Right outside the window. I could hear movement in the grass. That last entry scared me more than I wanted to admit. I hadn't imagined the sound of movement. The soft whisper of something brushing through the grass. The slight rustle that came from just beyond the glass. I'd sat frozen on that couch, my eyes locked on the window, seeing nothing but my own reflection in the dark glass and the faint shapes of trees beyond. I told my father about it on Saturday morning. We were in the kitchen and I was exhausted from another night of broken sleep. He was reading the newspaper, coffee in hand, the picture of Saturday morning normalcy. "Dad, have you heard anything weird at night? Like howling?" He glanced up from the sports section. "Coyotes. Sure. They're always out there this time of year." "No, this is different. It's louder, deeper, and it sounds like it's getting closer to the house." He folded the paper down, giving me his attention. "How close?" "Really close, like right outside the basement window." My father frowned, but I could see he wasn't taking it seriously. "Probably just sounds closer because you're in the basement. Sound carries differently underground, and your mother told me you've been staying up until all hours playing those games. When you're tired, things seem more dramatic than they are. It's not that. I'm telling you, something's out there. I'll take a look around the property later," he said, returning to his paper. "But I'm sure it's just coyotes. They den up in those woods every year. Nothing to worry about." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly. But that night when I heard the howl again, closer than ever, so close I could hear the breath behind it, I knew that whatever was out there, it wasn't a coyote. It happened on a Wednesday night, exactly 1 week after the howling started. I remember the date because I'd circled it on the calendar in my phone, marking it as the night everything changed. The heat had been particularly brutal that day. The kind of heat that makes your clothes stick to you and turns the steering wheel of your car into a branding iron. By the time evening came, I was desperate for the cool relief of the basement. I grabbed my pillow and blanket, told my parents I was going downstairs to watch a movie, and descended into my sanctuary. I'd chosen Thor Ragnarok from my Netflix queue, something light and fun that I'd seen a dozen times before. It was comfort viewing, background noise that didn't require much attention. I settled into the familiar sag of the couch, positioned so I could see both the TV and in my peripheral vision that window. The movie was about 40 minutes in when I heard the first tap. It was soft, so soft that I almost missed it under the dialogue from the TV. A single tap against the glass, like someone had gently knocked with one knuckle. I froze, my eyes sliding toward the window. The curtain was drawn, but it was a thin curtain, more decorative than functional. During the day, you could see shapes through it. At night, with the lights on inside and darkness outside, it was mostly opaque, but not entirely. I stared at it, barely breathing, waiting. Maybe it was a moth, attracted to the light inside. Maybe it was a twig blown against the glass by the wind. There were a dozen rational explanations. The second tap came harder, more deliberate. Knock, knock. 2 distinct strikes against the glass. My heart began to hammer in my chest. That wasn't a moth. That wasn't wind. That was intentional. I should have run right then. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get up, get away, get somewhere safe. But instead I found myself slowly rising from the couch, my legs moving independently of my conscious mind, carrying me toward that window. I reached for the curtain with a trembling hand. My mouth had gone completely dry. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and quick in the silence. I'd muted the TV without realizing it. The rational part of my brain was offering explanations. A bird, confused by its reflection. A branch blown against the glass. Maybe even my father checking on me from outside. But deeper down, in that primitive part of the brain that remembers when humans were prey, I knew that whatever was on the other side of that curtain wasn't anything that had a rational explanation. I pulled the curtain aside. The face was pressed against the glass, less than 2 feet from my own. I can still see it when I close my eyes. I'll probably see it for the rest of my life. The shape was wrong, elongated like someone had grabbed a human face and stretched it vertically. The skin had a grayish mottled appearance, hanging loose in places like it didn't quite fit over the skull beneath. There were no lips, just a gaping mouth full of teeth. Too many teeth, sharp and irregular, some pointing inward, some jutting out at odd angles. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me, or rather the absence of eyes. Where eyes should have been, there were just hollow sockets. Not empty exactly, but filled with a darkness that seemed to have depth, like looking into a well at midnight. The thing was smiling. At least that's what the arrangement of its mouth suggested. All those teeth bared in something that might have been a grin, if it had been on a human face. Its head tilted slowly to one side, the movement jerky and unnatural, like a bird examining something curious. I couldn't scream. My throat had closed up completely, my body locked in place by pure terror. We stared at each other, me and this thing, for what might have been 2 seconds or 2 hours. Time seemed to have stopped working properly. Then it moved. Its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and I saw its tongue, dark and pointed, move behind those jagged teeth. That broke the spell. I stumbled backward, my legs finally remembering how to work, and the scream that had been trapped in my throat came out as a strangled, wheezing gasp. I turned and ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, my feet slipping on the carpet, my hands grabbing the railing to keep from falling. "Dad," the word finally came out, hoarse and broken. "Dad." I could hear movement from my parents' bedroom, and then my father appeared in the hallway, squinting in the darkness. "What? What's wrong?" "Basement window. There's something." The words tumbled out incoherently. He flipped on the hall light, and I saw the concern on his face shift into something else, confusion mixed with alarm at my state. I must have looked terrified. I could feel the cold sweat on my face, feel my whole body shaking. "Show me," he said firmly. We went back down together, my father leading the way. He turned on every light as we descended, flooding the basement with harsh fluorescent brightness. When we reached the bottom, he went straight to the window and threw back the curtain. Nothing. Just the dark backyard and the tree line beyond. He unlocked the window and pushed it open, leaning out to look around. "I don't see anything." "It was there," I insisted, my voice still shaking. "Right there, pressing against the glass. Its face. It was—" "Hey," he interrupted gently, placing a hand on my shoulder. "It's okay. You probably dozed off. Had a bad dream. This heat, staying up late, it plays tricks on your mind." I wasn't asleep. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, especially with the TV on. Those horror movies you watch. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a dream. It was real. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to decide how to handle this. Finally, he nodded. "Okay. How about you sleep upstairs tonight? We'll figure this out in the morning." I wanted to argue, to make him believe me, but I was exhausted and terrified, and the basement suddenly felt like the last place on earth I wanted to be. So I gathered my blanket and pillow and followed him back upstairs, leaving the lights on behind us. That night, I slept in my sweltering bedroom with the door locked and my desk chair wedged under the handle. It didn't help much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those empty sockets and that terrible grin. And when I finally did sleep, I dreamed of tapping at my window. The next morning I came downstairs to find my father had already been outside. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, still wearing his yard work clothes despite the early hour. "I checked the whole perimeter," he said before I could ask. "No footprints, no disturbances in the grass under the window, no scratches on the glass, no marks of any kind." My mother looked up from her own coffee. "Sweetheart, your father told me what happened. Are you sure you weren't having a nightmare? You've been spending an awful lot of time in that basement." I know what I saw. But even as I said it, doubt crept in. My father was right. There should have been some evidence. Footprints, at least. The grass under that window had been dry for weeks. Anything stepping there should have left some kind of mark. "Maybe the heat's getting to you," my mother suggested gently. "Why don't you set up the portable AC in your room? It's not good for you to be isolated down there all night." I wanted to tell them about the howling, about the pattern I'd noticed, about the feeling of being watched that had been growing stronger each night. But looking at their concerned faces, their reasonable suggestions, I felt my certainty beginning to crumble. Maybe they were right. Maybe the combination of heat, exhaustion, and late-night horror movies had created something that seemed real but wasn't. The human mind was capable of incredible things, including convincing hallucinations. I'd read about that. Sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations, the power of suggestion. "I'll try sleeping upstairs tonight," I said finally. My mother smiled with relief. "Good, and maybe take a break from those horror movies for a while, I spent the day trying to convince myself they were right. I helped my father in the yard, worked on summer reading for school, did normal everyday things that had nothing to do with creatures at windows or strange howling in the night. The normalcy was comforting. In the bright light of day, with the sun beating down and the sounds of suburban life all around, lawnmowers, kids playing, dogs barking, the terror of the previous night seemed distant and unreal. But when evening came and the shadows grew long, the doubt began to fade. I stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the backyard as the light drained from the sky. Beyond our fence, the woods were already dark, a solid wall of shadow beneath the trees. And I knew with absolute certainty that what I'd seen had been real. The question was, what was I going to do about it? That night I lay in my bed with every light in my room turned on. The heat was oppressive. Even with the portable AC unit my dad had dragged up from storage, the room felt like a sauna, but I was determined to stay upstairs, to prove to myself and my parents that the basement incident had been an aberration. I must have dozed off around midnight, exhausted from a day of yard work and anxiety. I woke to the sound of Rusty barking. Our dog usually slept in the laundry room off the kitchen, and he rarely barked at night unless there was a good reason. But this wasn't his normal "I heard something" bark. A few sharp woofs and then silence. This was continuous, frantic. The kind of barking that said something was seriously wrong. I heard my father's footsteps in the hallway. Heard him going downstairs. "Rusty, quiet!" The barking stopped, replaced by a low, continuous growl that was somehow more unsettling than the barking had been. I got out of bed and crept to my window, pressing my face against the screen to look down at the backyard. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I spotted movement at the tree line. Something was there, just at the edge of the woods. Too tall to be a coyote, too still to be a deer. It stood upright, or at least mostly upright. There was something wrong with its posture, like it was hunched or bent in a way that wasn't quite natural. As I watched, it took a step forward, moving into the slightly lighter darkness of our yard. Another step. It was coming toward the house. Rusty's growling grew louder, more desperate. I heard my father trying to calm him, heard the confusion in his voice. The figure stopped about halfway across the yard, right at the edge of where the porch light's glow reached. It stood there, motionless, and even though I couldn't see its face from this angle, I knew it was looking up at the house. Looking up at me. "Dad," I called out, my voice cracking. "Dad, there's something in the yard." I heard him coming back up the stairs. Heard him enter my room. "What are you?" He joined me at the window, and we both looked out. The yard was empty. "It was there," I insisted. "Right there, in the middle of the yard. I saw it." My father stared out the window for a long moment. "I don't see anything, son. It was there 30 seconds ago." He put his hand on my shoulder, but this time his grip was firmer, less comforting. "You need to stop this. You're working yourself into a state. There's nothing out there. You're seeing things because you're looking for them." Then why was Rusty barking? Because you're anxious, and he can sense it. Dogs pick up on that stuff. You're creating a feedback loop. You're scared, so he's on edge, which makes you more scared. That's not enough. His voice was sharp now, the patience worn thin. "I've been out there. I've checked every inch of this property. There is nothing unusual happening. You had a nightmare, and now you're letting it control you. Tomorrow, you're going to spend the day doing something productive. No TV, no video games, no sitting around thinking about this. Understood?" I nodded mutely, feeling frustration and fear warring inside me. He thought I was being irrational, hysterical even. And maybe I was, but I knew what I'd seen, both times. After he left, I stayed at the window for hours, watching the empty yard and the dark woods beyond. Nothing moved, nothing came, but I could feel it out there, watching the house, watching me, waiting. I tried to follow my father's instructions. Really, I did. The next day, I volunteered to help with every chore I could think of. Mowing the lawn, trimming hedges, cleaning out the garage. Physical labor in the summer heat, exhausting enough to make me too tired to think, too tired to worry. But working in the yard meant being close to those woods. And every time I glanced toward the tree line, I felt watched. There was never anything there, never any movement or sound, but the feeling persisted. It was like standing with your back to a mirror, knowing that if you turned around, you might see something reflected that shouldn't be there. Rusty wouldn't go past the patio. Every time I tried to call him further into the yard, he'd plant his feet and refuse to budge, his eyes fixed on the woods. He'd never been a skittish dog, but now he acted like the yard had become enemy territory. "He's picking up on your anxiety," my father said when I pointed this out. But I could tell it bothered him too, just a little. The dog's behavior was unusual. That evening, against my better judgment and my parents' wishes, I returned to the basement. I couldn't help it. Part of it was defiance, a teenager's natural resistance to being told what to do, but part of it was something else, something harder to explain. I needed to know if it would come back. I needed to confront whatever this was, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I set up my usual spot on the couch, but this time I positioned myself differently. I sat with my back to the wall, where I could see both the TV and the window without having to turn my head. I kept the lights brighter than usual, and had my phone in my hand, ready to take a picture if anything appeared. The movie I chose didn't matter. I wasn't really watching it. My attention was fixed on that window, on the darkness beyond the glass. Hours passed. 10 o'clock became 11, became midnight. My eyes burned from staring and my body ached from sitting so tensely. Nothing happened. Decided to relax around 1 a.m. My hypervigilance finally wearing off. Maybe my parents were right. Maybe I'd let fear and imagination run away with me. Maybe I'd let fear and imagination run away with me. The scratching started. It wasn't loud at first, just a soft, rhythmic sound like fingernails dragging across wood. It came from the back door, the one that led from the basement directly into the backyard. My father had installed it years ago for convenience, though we rarely used it. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A pause. Then again. Scratch, scratch. I sat frozen on the couch, every muscle rigid. My phone clutched so tightly in my hand that my knuckles went white. The scratching continued, patient and methodical, like whatever was out there had all the time in the world. It moved. The sound traveled down the door, getting lower, like the thing making it was squatting down, examining the door from top to bottom. I heard a soft thump, something testing the door's resistance. The doorknob rattled. My breath caught in my throat. The knob turned slightly, first one way, then the other, testing. The door was locked, thank God. The deadbolt was engaged, but watching that knob move of its own accord was one of the most terrifying things I'd ever experienced. The scratching resumed, moving from the door to the wall beside it, long, slow drags of something sharp against the painted concrete. 4 parallel lines of sound, like claws. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there frozen, but my body wouldn't respond. I was locked in place, a prisoner of my own fear, watching that doorknob and listening to that horrible scratching. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound had been. I strained to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, movement. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the TV and my own harsh breathing. Minutes passed. 5, then 10, then 15. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My eyes were locked on that door, waiting for the scratching to resume, for the doorknob to turn again. It didn't. Finally, when I couldn't stand it anymore, I crept toward the stairs. I moved slowly, quietly, terrified that any sound I made would bring the scratching back. Each step felt like it took an hour. When I reached the stairs, I took them 2 at a time, not caring anymore about noise, just desperate to get away from that door and whatever had been on the other side of it. I didn't tell my parents this time. What was the point? They'd already decided I was imagining things, but I knew what I'd heard. And more importantly, I knew that whatever was out there was getting bolder. It wasn't content to just watch anymore. The next morning I waited until my father left for work before going outside. I had to see the door myself, had to check if the scratching had left any marks. The back basement door was old, painted white years ago, the paint now yellowing and peeling in places. It faced north, protected from the worst of the sun, but exposed to the weather. I approached it slowly, my stomach tight with anticipation and dread. At first I didn't see anything. The door looked exactly as it always had, old, weathered, but unmarked. Relief and disappointment warred inside me. Part of me had wanted proof, something to show my parents that I wasn't crazy. Then I looked lower, at the section of door just above the knob. There were marks. Not deep gouges, not the obvious claw marks I'd been expecting. But there were definitely marks, thin, parallel lines in the paint, 4 of them spaced like fingers, or like claws. They were faint, barely visible, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for them. I ran my fingers over them. The lines were rough, like something had scratched through the top layer of paint to the older paint beneath. My hand was shaking as I pulled out my phone and took pictures. Multiple angles, trying to capture the marks clearly. The wall beside the door showed similar marks, though these were even fainter. I took pictures of those too. It was proof. Not conclusive, maybe. My father would probably say they'd always been there, that I just hadn't noticed them before. But I knew better. I'd been past this door 1,000 times over the years. These marks were new. I was so focused on documenting the scratches that I almost missed the other sign. The grass beneath the basement window, the window where I'd seen that face, was disturbed. Not trampled. Exactly, but pressed down in a pattern that suggested something had stood there. And in the dry soil at the base of the foundation, right below the window, there was an impression. A footprint. My heart started racing as I knelt down to examine it. It wasn't a clear print, not like you'd see in mud, but the shape was there, elongated, narrow, with odd protrusions at what should have been the toes. It was unlike any shoe print I'd ever seen. I took more pictures, trying to capture it from different angles. The morning sun was getting stronger, and I knew the heat would erase whatever subtle details remained. I needed to document this now. "What are you doing?" I jerked upright, nearly dropping my phone. My mother stood on the patio, coffee mug in hand, watching me with a mixture of concern and suspicion. "There are marks," I said, gesturing to the door, "and a footprint. Here, under the window." She came down the steps slowly, her expression skeptical. I showed her the scratches on the door first, running my finger along the faint lines. "Honey, this door is ancient. There are marks all over it." "These are new. Look at them. You can see where the top layer of paint has been scraped away." She examined the door, her frown deepening. "They could be from anything. The lawnmower hitting the door, a rake leaning against it. And the footprint?" We moved to the window, and I pointed out the impression in the soil. She crouched down, studying it, and for a moment I thought she might actually believe me. "It's not a shoe print," she said finally. "The shape is wrong." "Exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's not a shoe print because it wasn't made by a person." "Then what was it made by?" I didn't have an answer for that. What could I say? A monster? Some kind of creature that presses its face to windows and scratches at doors. It sounded insane, even in my own head. My mother stood up, brushing dirt from her hands. "I think you've been spending too much time on this. Your father's right. You're working yourself into a state over nothing. These marks could be from anything, and that impression in the dirt is probably from the downspout overflowing during that storm last week." "Mom, please." "No." Her voice was firm. "This stops now. I don't know if you're doing this for attention or if you genuinely believe what you're saying, but either way, it's not healthy. You're seeing patterns where there are none. That's what anxiety does. It makes you find threats in everything." She put her hand on my shoulder, her expression softening. "I think you should talk to someone. Dr. Phillips has an opening next week. It might help to..." "I'm not crazy. No one's saying you're crazy, but stress and anxiety can make you see and hear things that aren't there. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Lots of people go through it." I wanted to argue, to make her understand, but I could see it was pointless. She'd already decided what was happening. To her, this was a mental health issue, not a real threat. And maybe from the outside looking in, that made sense. If someone had told me this story, I probably would have drawn the same conclusion. But I knew what I'd experienced. I knew what I'd seen and heard. And looking at those scratches on the door, at that strange impression in the soil, I knew I was right to be afraid. I stopped trying to convince my parents. It was clear they wouldn't believe me, and continued insistence was only making things worse. My mother had made an appointment with Dr. Phillips for the following Tuesday, and my father had started watching me with a mixture of concern and frustration that made me feel guilty despite knowing I hadn't done anything wrong. So I decided to handle it myself. I started researching, spending hours online looking for anything that might explain what I was experiencing. I searched for stories of similar encounters, for reports of strange creatures in our area, for any scrap of information that might help me understand what I was dealing with. What I found was both comforting and terrifying. There were stories, lots of them. People reporting strange howling in the woods. Encounters with something that looked almost human but wrong in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Faces at windows, scratching at doors. The details varied, but the core elements were disturbingly similar to my own experiences. Most of the accounts came from rural areas, places where houses backed up to forests or open land. The encounters always happened at night. The creatures, if that's what they were, seemed drawn to light, to windows, to the boundaries between wild spaces and human habitation. But I found no explanations. No one seemed to know what these things were or where they came from. The stories just ended with the witnesses either being dismissed as crazy or the experiences simply stopping as mysteriously as they'd started. I made a decision. I would document everything. I would set up my phone to record through the night, positioned to capture both the window and the back door. If the creature returned, I'd have proof. Video evidence that even my parents couldn't dismiss. That evening, I returned to the basement with my phone fully charged and set to record. I positioned it on the bookshelf, angled to capture the maximum area, and started the video. Then I settled onto the couch to wait. The hours passed slowly. I kept the TV on but muted, just for the light. The basement felt different now, charged with anticipation and fear. Every sound made me tense. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threat. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m., 2 a.m. At 2:17 a.m., according to the timestamp on the video I'd later review, Rusty started barking upstairs. Not the frantic barking from before, but low warning barks that raised the hair on my arms. Then I heard it. The soft scrape of something moving outside the window. My eyes locked on the curtain. In the peripheral glow from the TV, I could see the fabric moving slightly, as if disturbed by breath on the other side of the glass. A shadow fell across the curtain, the outline of a head, tilted at that same unnatural angle I remembered from before. I sat perfectly still, my heart hammering, knowing that my phone was recording everything. The shadow remained, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. Then it moved closer, and I could see the impression of features through the thin fabric, the elongated shape of the head, the hollow eyes, that terrible mouth. It was studying the window, I realized, looking for a way in. Then, so slowly I almost missed it, I saw the window frame begin to flex. It was pushing, testing the window's resistance. The old lock creaked slightly under the pressure. That broke my paralysis. I shot up from the couch and the shadow immediately pulled back from the window. I heard a soft thump, feet hitting the ground, and then rapid movement around the side of the house. I ran to the window and yanked the curtain aside, pressing my face to the glass. I could see something moving away from the house, a dark shape that seemed to flow rather than walk, heading toward the tree line with impossible speed. Then it stopped. Right at the edge of the woods, it stopped and turned back to look at the house. Even from this distance, even in the darkness, I could feel its gaze. We stared at each other across the expanse of the yard, predator and prey, and I understood something in that moment. This wasn't random. It wasn't just a creature wandering through the woods who happened to notice our house. It had chosen us, chosen me, and it wasn't going to stop until it found a way in. The creature faded into the trees, and I was left standing at the window, shaking, my breath fogging the glass. I went to my phone and stopped the recording. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hit the button. But I had it. I had proof. I barely slept that night, even after retreating upstairs with my phone clutched in my hand like a talisman. I kept checking the video to make sure it was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The footage was grainy. The basement lighting hadn't been ideal, but it was there. The shadow at the window, the clear outline of something not human, the movement of the window frame under pressure. The next morning I showed my parents the video. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us crowded around my phone. I watched their faces as they watched the footage, looking for any sign of belief, of understanding. The video played through in silence. When it ended, my father sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Well," I asked, "do you believe me now?" My father rubbed his face with both hands. "I see a shadow, could be anything casting it. A branch, a tarp blowing in the wind. You can see the shape, you can see it's not a branch. I see a blur that could be interpreted as a shape," he said carefully. "The video quality isn't good enough to draw any conclusions." "What about the window moving? You can hear it creaking." Old windows creak, especially in the heat and humidity. The house settles. I turned to my mother, desperate. "Mom?" She looked troubled, but her answer was the same. "Sweetheart, I know you believe you saw something, and I'm not saying you're lying, but this video doesn't show what you think it shows. Our minds fill in gaps, make patterns where there aren't any. That's why eyewitness testimony is so unreliable. I felt my hopes crumbling. Even with evidence they wouldn't believe. Or maybe they couldn't believe. Maybe accepting what I was showing them was too far outside their worldview, too threatening to their sense of reality. I know what I saw, I said quietly. Then we'll get you help, my mother replied gently. Dr. Phillips is excellent. He's helped a lot of people with anxiety and I'm not anxious. I'm scared. There's a difference. The appointment is Tuesday, my father said, his tone brooking no argument. Until then, you're sleeping upstairs. The basement is off limits. Fine, I said, pushing back from the table. What else could I say? They'd made up their minds. I spent the rest of the weekend upstairs, but I kept watch from my window. During the day, the yard and woods looked normal, peaceful even. Birds sang in the trees. Squirrels chased each other across the lawn. The world continued as if nothing was wrong. But at night, the howling returned. And now I could hear other things too. Movement in the woods, the crack of branches, sounds that suggested something large pacing back and forth just beyond the tree line. Rusty had stopped sleeping in the laundry room. Now he insisted on sleeping in the upstairs hallway, positioning himself between my room and the stairs, as if standing guard. On Monday night I made a decision. I couldn't live like this, trapped in fear, waiting for whatever was out there to find a way in. I couldn't convince my parents to take action, so I would have to do it myself. I waited until the house was quiet, until I was sure my parents were asleep. Then I crept downstairs, grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, and went to the back door. I was going into those woods. I was going to find where this thing came from, what it was, and maybe if I was very lucky how to make it leave us alone. My hand was on the doorknob when a voice stopped me. Don't. I turned to find my father standing in the kitchen doorway, backlit by the hall light. He was in his pajamas, his hair disheveled, but his expression was serious. I know what you're planning, he continued, walking into the room, and I'm telling you, don't do it. I have to do something. No, you don't. Because there's nothing out there to confront. Son, listen to me. I know you believe what you're saying, but going out there in the middle of the night, working yourself up even more, it's only going to make things worse. I stared at him, and something in his expression made me pause. There was something he wasn't saying, some knowledge behind his eyes that he was keeping from me. You've heard it too, haven't you? I said slowly. The howling, you've heard it. He hesitated, and in that hesitation I had my answer. It's just coyotes, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. You're lying. You know something's wrong. You know I'm not making this up. What I know, he said firmly, is that people see and hear things in the dark that seem threatening but aren't. I know that our minds are wired to find patterns and threats, even when they're not there. And I know that going out into those woods at night is dangerous regardless of what you think you're going to find. So you'd rather just pretend nothing's happening? I'd rather keep my son safe, which means keeping you inside this house where you're protected. Protected. The word echoed in my mind. Protected from what? If there was nothing out there. We stood in silence, the kitchen clock ticking loudly between us. Finally, my father crossed the room and gently took the flashlight from my hand. Go back to bed, he said quietly. We'll talk more in the morning. After you see Dr. Phillips, maybe we can figure this out together. I nodded, defeated, and turned to go upstairs. But as I passed him, he put a hand on my shoulder, stopping me. Lock your door tonight, he said, so quietly I almost missed it. And keep it locked. I looked at him sharply, but his expression had closed off again, neutral and parental. Dad, if you know something. Good night, son. I went upstairs, my mind racing. My father knew something. Maybe he didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew it wasn't just in my head. That had to be why he told me to lock my door. I did as he instructed, locking my bedroom door and pushing my desk chair under the handle for good measure. Then I sat on my bed and waited, watching the window, the door, listening to every creak and whisper of the old house. The howling came around 2:30 a.m., just like always. But this time, it was different. This time, there were two voices answering each other across the darkness, one from deep in the woods and one closer, much closer, right at the edge of our yard. And this time, instead of rising and falling, the howls maintained the same pitch, the same tone, for an impossibly long duration. Almost like they were communicating, passing information back and forth in a language made of sustained, mournful notes. I sat on my bed, knees pulled to my chest, and watched the sky slowly lighten outside my window, watched the shadows retreat, and the familiar world reassert itself with the dawn. But I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that the familiar world was an illusion. There were things in those woods, ancient things, wrong things, that didn't follow the rules we'd constructed to make ourselves feel safe. And one of those things had decided it wanted to get closer to humanity. It had chosen our house, our family, as the boundary it intended to cross. The question that kept me awake until sunrise wasn't whether it would find a way in. The question was, when? The howling continued for 3 more weeks after that night. Then, as mysteriously as it had begun, it stopped. We never saw the creature again, never found any more evidence of its presence. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be, after everything that had happened. My parents never spoke of it again. Dr. Phillips prescribed me medication for anxiety, which I took to keep the peace, but which didn't change what I knew to be true. We moved away 2 years later, my father citing job opportunities downstate. But I knew the real reason. Sometimes, late at night in that house, we'd all hear sounds we couldn't explain. Sounds that suggested something was testing the boundaries, looking for weaknesses, patient in a way that only something that wasn't truly alive could be. I'm 26 now, living in the city, far from any woods. But sometimes on hot summer nights when I can't sleep, I find myself at the window, looking out into the darkness between buildings. And I wonder if it's still out there, that thing from the woods. If it ever found its way in, or if it moved on to another house, another family, another window to press its terrible face against. I wonder, and I make sure every lock is secure before I try to sleep. This happened in 1992. My name is Mason Herford, and I'm about to tell you a story that still chills me to the bone, even after all these years. I had a simple life out in western Montana, living off the grid on a piece of land my father left me. I didn't need much, just a roof, some chickens, a solar setup, and a wood stove. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked the quiet. You'd think being a logger most of my life would make me accustomed to the forest, but that was before, well before all of this. I don't like talking about my past much, but I wasn't always this far removed from society. I'd spent a good chunk of my younger years in Bozeman, drinking away a pretty decent life, got into a lot of fights, went through a marriage that lasted shorter than one of Montana's early springs. And somewhere along the line, I figured I'd rather be left alone, so I built a cabin and left the rest of the world behind. I didn't own a gun though, which surprises some folks. I never felt I needed one. Wolves and bears kept their distance, and the human types didn't come out this far unless they were lost or stupid. I figured I was good. Funny, isn't it? A guy like me thinking he's prepared, living his life out here like he's invincible. Turns out there are worse things than wolves or bad weather. It started when a friend of mine, Jason Avery, one of the few people I kept in touch with, told me he wanted to come visit. We'd been logger buddies for years. He was one of the last to see me before I threw in the towel and moved out here. Said he was driving in from Wyoming, but his truck broke down somewhere near Helena. Asked if I could pick him up. Reluctantly, I agreed. I'm not much of a people person, even less of a drive 2 hours kind of guy. But Jason, he'd been good to me, so I figured I'd return the favor. It was a long drive and the roads were winding and miserable, exactly what you'd expect from rural Montana. When I finally reached him, he was at this small, dingy gas station, looking about as out of place as a fish on land. He'd already had a few beers, his usual way of making bad situations better. "You got a plan for getting that thing fixed?" I asked, eyeing his truck. "Not a damn clue, Mason, but I figure we'll deal with that tomorrow. You still got that spare room?" I didn't, but I told him we'd figure it out. We made the drive back to my place, mostly in silence, Jason nodding off in the passenger seat. I wasn't far from my cabin when I noticed something odd. There was an old dirt road I didn't remember ever seeing before. Now I know these woods. I've lived here for years, and I've walked every inch of the surrounding forest. But this road, it felt wrong. Ever seen that before? I asked Jason, pointing to the turnoff. He rubbed his eyes and squinted. Nah, but I ain't been around here much. Maybe it's new. There's nothing new out here, and that's what bugged me. Still, I brushed it off. I was tired, and I didn't feel like driving us down some random road just because it gave me the creeps. I should have paid more attention to my gut. Instead, I headed straight to the cabin, figuring I'd deal with the weird road later. When we pulled up, everything seemed fine. My chickens were making their usual racket, and the trees stood as silent sentinels around the property. Jason unloaded his bags, and after some small talk, we called it a night. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that road. Something gnawed at me. I figured it was just the beer and the late-night drive, so I eventually drifted off. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of the chickens losing their minds. Now, chickens aren't the smartest creatures, but they know when something's out of place. I grabbed a flashlight, figuring maybe a raccoon had gotten into the coop. Jason must have heard it too, because he stumbled out of the living room where he was sleeping on the couch. "You hear that?" he asked. "Yeah, I'm going to check it out." I didn't make it more than a few steps before I noticed something else. This awful smell, like something rotting. But it wasn't just coming from the coop. It was everywhere, hanging in the air like a blanket of death. Jason smelled it too. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. "I don't know, but it ain't good." When I reached the coop, the chickens were alive, but they were all huddled together, crammed into the farthest corner like they were trying to get away from something. That's when I saw it. Something had torn the fencing clean apart. The wire wasn't just cut, it was ripped open, like something big had pushed through it. And on the ground, blood. A lot of it, but no bodies. I crouched down, shined the light into the darkness beyond the coop, and that's when I saw tracks. Big ones, too big to be a bear, too wide to be a wolf. "Jason," I called, keeping my voice steady. "Get over here." He came over and looked where I was pointing. "You ever seen tracks like that before?" "No," I said quietly, "and I don't think I want to." Now, a sensible man might have packed up right then and there, but we didn't. Call it curiosity or plain stupidity, but we decided to follow the tracks. They led us deeper into the woods, away from the cabin. The deeper we went, the stronger the stench became, and soon it felt like we were walking into a graveyard. Then we saw it. In a clearing, half hidden by tall grass, was a carcass. It looked like a deer, but it had been torn apart. The guts were spread out like something had played with it, almost arranged in a deliberate pattern. But it wasn't just the deer that stopped us cold. Beside it, there was a man's arm, fresh, blood still oozing from the stump. Jason turned away, gagging. "Jesus, Mason, what the hell?" I didn't answer. I was staring at something else. Movement just beyond the clearing between the trees. It was subtle at first, like a shadow too big to be real. But then it stepped forward, and my blood ran cold. I couldn't tell you exactly what it was. It moved on 4 legs, but its body was twisted, like something had smashed an animal together with a human. It had the bulk of a bear, but its movements were too calculated, too controlled. And that smell, it was like it brought the stench with it, the air around it thickening with decay. I've seen enough wildlife to know when something's off, but this thing, it was all wrong. Jason whispered, "What the hell is that?" "We need to go," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. But Jason, being Jason, wasn't having it. "No way, we gotta kill it." He pulled a hunting knife from his pack, like that'd be enough to stop whatever that thing was. I knew better. I grabbed his arm. "We're leaving, now." That's when it turned toward us. It didn't roar, didn't make a sound. It just started moving, faster than anything that size should. I yanked Jason, and we ran, crashing through the trees like idiots. Behind us, I could hear it tearing through the underbrush, gaining on us. There was no time to think, no time to plan. We hit the dirt road near the cabin, and Jason tripped, falling hard. I turned back, and in the split second I hesitated. The thing was on him. It happened so fast, I barely had time to process it. One moment Jason was scrambling to his feet. The next he was screaming as the thing dug its claws into his back, ripping him open like a rag doll. Blood sprayed everywhere, and all I could do was run. I ran back to the cabin, locking myself inside. The thing didn't follow me. Maybe it was satisfied with what it had done. Maybe it just didn't care about me. Either way, I sat there in silence, the sound of Jason's screams fading into the night. By morning, the woods were quiet again. I forced myself to go back out, back to the clearing where Jason had fallen. His body was there, torn to shreds, but not dragged away. His eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, and the tracks around him were unmistakable. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before, but it had left its mark. I called the sheriff, of course, told him about the attack, about the tracks. They came out, took one look at Jason's body and called it a bear attack. I didn't argue, let them believe what they wanted, but I knew the truth. I still know it. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, and it's not just killing for food. The days following Jason's death were a blur. The police came and went, asking questions I couldn't answer truthfully without sounding like a madman. I told them what they wanted to hear, that we'd been drinking, that Jason had wandered off in the night, that I'd found his body in the morning. They seemed satisfied with that explanation, chalking it up to another tragic encounter between man and nature. But I knew better. The image of that thing was burned into my mind. Its twisted form, the way it moved with an unnatural grace, the stench of death that clung to it like a second skin. It wasn't natural, wasn't something that belonged in this world, and yet here it was, in my woods, turning my sanctuary into a nightmare. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jason's face, contorted in terror. I heard his screams echoing through the trees, and underneath it all, I felt the presence of that creature, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I started fortifying the cabin, boarded up the windows, reinforced the door. I dug out an old shotgun my father had left me, kept it loaded and by my side at all times. The chickens, I let them go. Better they had a chance to survive in the wild than be sitting ducks for that monster. But even as I tried to make myself feel safer, I knew deep down that if that thing wanted in, no amount of wood and nails would keep it out. Still, it gave me something to do, kept my hands busy and my mind from dwelling too much on what had happened. Weeks passed, and slowly, life tried to return to normal. The police stopped coming around. The forest seemed to settle back into its usual rhythms, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear something moving outside the cabin, heavy footsteps, branches snapping under an enormous weight, and always that smell. I started keeping a journal, partly to keep myself sane, partly to leave a record in case I didn't make it. I wrote down everything I could remember about that night, every detail about the creature. I drew sketches, trying to capture its horrifying form on paper. Looking back at those drawings now, they don't do justice to the terror of the real thing, but they're close enough to make my skin crawl. One night, about a month after Jason's death, I woke up to a sound I'd never heard before. It was like a howl, but deeper, more guttural. It echoed through the woods, setting every nerve in my body on edge. I grabbed my shotgun and waited, heart pounding for something to happen, but nothing did. The sound faded away, leaving behind an eerie silence. The next morning I found tracks again. This time they circled the entire cabin like the thing had been pacing, looking for a way in. And there, scratched deep into the trunk of a nearby tree, were 3 long gouges. A warning? A threat? I couldn't be sure, but I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin anymore. It wasn't safe. I packed what I could into my truck and left. Drove straight into town and got a room at the local motel. I must have looked a sight, wild-eyed, unshaven, clutching my shotgun like it was a lifeline. The motel owner gave me a wary look but didn't ask questions. Small towns, you learn not to pry too much into other people's business. For a while I thought about leaving Montana altogether, starting fresh somewhere else, somewhere far away from the memories of that night. But something kept me here. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was a feeling that this wasn't over, that I had a responsibility to stop this thing, or at least warn others about it. So I started digging. Spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers, looking for any similar incidents in the area's history. And I found them. Not many, and not recent, but they were there. Stories of mysterious animal attacks, of hunters gone missing, of strange sounds in the night. Most were dismissed as tall tales or the fevered imaginations of isolated mountain folk. But I knew better. I reached out to a few people. Rangers. Old-timers who'd lived in these parts all their lives. Most thought I was crazy. but a few had stories of their own. They spoke in hushed tones of things they'd seen in the deepest parts of the forest, of tracks that didn't match any known animal, of the feeling of being watched by something ancient and malevolent. One old man, a former park ranger named Frank, told me a story that chilled me to the bone. Back in the 60s, he'd been part of a search party looking for a missing hiker. They'd found the man's campsite torn apart, blood everywhere. But it was what they found nearby that haunted Frank to this day. It was like a shrine, he told me, his hands shaking as he spoke. All these bones, arranged in a circle, animal bones, human bones, all mixed together, and in the center, this totem, made of antlers and skulls and God knows what else. It wasn't natural, wasn't something any animal would do, and the smell, Lord, the smell, like death itself had set up shop in those woods. Frank's story matched too closely with what I'd seen to be a coincidence. Whatever this thing was, it had been here for a long time. And it wasn't just killing for food. It was ritualistic, deliberate, intelligent in a way that no natural predator should be. I started mapping out the attacks, the sightings, trying to find a pattern. And slowly one started to emerge. A rough circle, centered on a part of the forest that was rarely visited. Too rough, too remote for even the most experienced hikers. The locals called it the dead zone, a place where compasses spun wildly and GPS devices failed. I knew then what I had to do. I had to go back into those woods, had to find whatever was at the center of that circle. Maybe I could find a way to stop it, or at least understand what it was. But one thing was certain. I couldn't let anyone else suffer the way Jason had. I couldn't let this thing continue its reign of terror unchecked. So I prepared, bought better gear, studied survival techniques, even took a few tracking classes. I wasn't going in unprepared this time, and all the while I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that something big was coming. I was right, but I had no idea just how big it would be. The day I set out for the dead zone dawned cold and gray. A mist hung low over the trees, turning the forest into a maze of shadows and half-seen shapes. It felt like the woods themselves were trying to warn me off, to keep their secrets hidden. But I was past the point of no return. I'd left notes with a few trusted people. Frank the ex-ranger, the local sheriff who thought I was chasing ghost stories but humored me anyway, and a journalist friend in Bozeman who promised to investigate if I didn't come back. It wasn't much of a safety net, but it was something. The hike was brutal. The terrain got rougher the deeper I went, the trees growing closer together, blocking out what little light made it through the clouds, and always there was that feeling of being watched. Eyes in the shadows, movement just at the edge of my vision. More than once I caught myself reaching for my shotgun, only to realize it was just the wind in the leaves or a startled animal. But as I got closer to the center of the dead zone, things started to change. The forest grew quieter. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow up every sound I made. And then there was the smell. That same rotting stench I'd encountered the night Jason died. It got stronger with every step, until it was all I could do not to gag. My eyes watered, my stomach churned, but I pressed on. It was late afternoon when I found the first sign that I was on the right track. A tree, its bark stripped away, with those same 3 gouges I'd seen back at my cabin. But these were older, the edges of the cuts weathered and gray. This thing had marked its territory, and I was deep in it now. I pressed on, my senses on high alert. As the daylight began to fade, I came across more disturbing signs. Bones scattered on the forest floor, some clearly animal, others disturbingly human-like, and always those strange markings on the trees, gouges that seemed to form patterns if you looked at them long enough. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots and my own labored breathing. The air grew thick, almost soupy, and that putrid smell became so strong it made my eyes water. I knew I was getting close to something, but what exactly, I couldn't say. Just as the last light was fading from the sky, I stumbled into a clearing. What I saw there nearly stopped my heart. It was like something out of a nightmare. In the center of the clearing stood a massive structure, easily 20 feet tall. It looked like it had been crafted from the bones and antlers of 1,000 animals, all woven together in an intricate, horrifying tapestry. Human skulls grinned from various points in the structure, their empty eye sockets seeming to follow my every move. Around the base of this grotesque totem, arranged in concentric circles, were more bones. Some were obviously fresh, the meat barely stripped from them. Others were old and weathered, bleached white by the sun. The ground was stained dark with what could only be blood, both old and new. I stood there frozen in horror, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just the lair of some animal. This was something else entirely. Something intelligent. Something that understood symbolism and ritual. Something that had been here, doing this, for a very long time. That's when I heard it. A low rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, shotgun raised, but saw nothing in the gathering darkness. The growl came again, closer this time, and with it came that overwhelming stench of decay. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, and turned just in time to see it emerge from the shadows. The creature, the thing that had killed Jason. But now, seeing it fully for the first time, I realized how little I had truly comprehended its horror that night. It was massive, easily 9 feet tall even on all fours. Its body was a twisted amalgamation of bear and something almost human, covered in patchy fur matted with blood and filth. Its face was the worst part. A bear's muzzle, but too long, too pointed, with human-like eyes gleaming with a terrible intelligence. And its mouth, dear God, its mouth was filled with row upon row of sharp, gleaming teeth. I raised my shotgun, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely aim. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with an almost curious expression. Then it spoke. Yes, spoke. The sound that came from its throat was like gravel being ground together, but the words were clear enough. You should not be here. I nearly dropped my gun in shock. This thing, this monster could talk. It was then that I realized I wasn't dealing with some animal, or even some undiscovered species. This was something else entirely. Something old. Something evil. What are you? I managed to croak out. The creature's mouth stretched into what might have been a grin, revealing even more of those terrible teeth. I am hunger, it growled. I am the forest. I am eternal. It took a step toward me, its massive claws leaving deep gouges in the earth. And you are food. I fired then, the sound of the shotgun impossibly loud in the quiet clearing. The creature jerked back, more in surprise than pain, I think. Dark, almost black blood oozed from where the buckshot had peppered its shoulder, but it seemed more annoyed than hurt. I turned and ran, crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear the creature pursuing, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they were on fire. But I knew it wasn't enough. This thing knew these woods far better than I ever could. It was just toying with me now. As if to prove my point, it suddenly burst from the trees ahead of me, cutting off my escape. I skidded to a stop, raising my shotgun again. But before I could fire, it swatted the weapon from my hands with one massive paw. I fell backward, scrambling away on all fours as it loomed over me. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die. But then something strange happened. The creature paused, its nose twitching. It looked up, as if listening to something I couldn't hear, and then to my utter disbelief, it spoke again. Not yet, it growled. Not your time. It leaned in close, its hot, fetid breath washing over me. Tell them, it said. Tell them I am here. Tell them I hunger. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest, leaving me alone in the darkness.
I don't know how long I lay there, shaking, waiting for it to return. But eventually I managed to pull myself to my feet. I found my shotgun, though it seemed like a pathetic defense now that I knew what I was up against.
Somehow I made it back to civilization. I've told my story, though few believe me. Those who do don't know what to do with the information. How do you fight something like that? Something that's not just a predator, but a force of nature. I don't have those answers. All I know is that it's out there, waiting, watching, hungry. And someday, it will come for us all. In the months that followed my encounter in the dead zone, I tried to return to some semblance of normal life. But how could I, knowing what was out there? The creature's words haunted me. Tell them I am here. Tell them I hunger. I did tell them. I went to the authorities, to the media, to anyone who would listen. Most dismissed me as a crackpot, a man driven mad by isolation and tragedy. A few listened, but what could they do? How do you fight something that defies all natural laws? But word spread, as it always does in small towns. Whispers of a monster in the woods, of missing hikers and mutilated animals. Some believed, some didn't, but everyone became a little more cautious. The woods that had once been a place of beauty and adventure now held a sense of dread. I couldn't stay in my cabin anymore. Too many memories. Too much fear. I moved into town, took a job at the local hardware store, tried to rebuild some kind of life, but always, I kept my eye on the forest. And then, about a year after my encounter, the disappearances started again. A group of campers vanished without a trace. Then a solo hiker. Then a pair of hunters. Each time, the searches found nothing but torn campsites and those familiar terrible claw marks on the trees. The town was in a panic. The tourism that was the lifeblood of the community dried up. People started to leave, unable to live with the constant fear. Those who stayed walked around with haunted looks, jumping at shadows. I knew it was time. The creature was making its move, expanding its territory. It had to be stopped, or at least contained. But how? I went back to my research, poring over every scrap of information I could find. Old legends, folklore, anything that might give me a clue about what this thing was and how to fight it. Then slowly, a plan began to form. There were stories, ancient tales from the indigenous people of the area, about a great evil in the woods. They spoke of a ritual, a way to bind the creature to a specific area. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it might buy us time. I gathered a group of believers, Frank the ex-ranger, a local Blackfeet shaman named John Rainwater, and a few others who had seen enough to know the threat was real. We prepared as best we could, gathering supplies and steeling our nerves for what was to come. The night we entered the woods was moonless, the darkness almost solid around us. We made our way to the clearing with the bone structure, our path lit only by flashlights and the warm glow of ritual candles. John began the ceremony, his voice rising and falling in an ancient chant. The air grew thick with the smell of sage and sweetgrass. And then, just as we had hoped and feared, the creature came. It burst into the clearing with a roar that shook the trees, its massive form even more terrifying than I remembered. But this time, we were ready. We had laid traps, blessed silver cables that tightened around its limbs as it charged. The creature howled in pain and rage, thrashing against its bonds. John's chanting grew louder, more insistent. I stood my ground, shotgun raised, as the others continued the ritual. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, filled with a hatred so intense it almost had physical weight. "You," it growled. "You dare." "This ends now," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "You don't belong here. Go back to whatever hell you came from." The creature laughed, a sound like bones breaking. "I am eternal," it said. "I am the forest. I am—" Its words were cut off as John completed the ritual. A blast of energy, invisible but palpable, swept through the clearing. The creature screamed, a sound of pure agony that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. And then silence. The creature was gone, but not destroyed. We had bound it, trapped it within a specific area deep in the woods. It would be able to roam within that space, but not beyond. Not for a long time, at least. We made our way out of the forest as dawn broke, exhausted but victorious. The town celebrated when they heard the news, though few understood the true nature of what had happened. Life slowly returned to normal. The tourists came back. The fear faded. But those of us who knew the truth never forgot. We set up a watch, a group dedicated to monitoring the bounds of the creature's prison, making sure it stayed contained. As for me, I couldn't leave. This was my home, and now it was my responsibility. I rebuilt my cabin, stronger this time, a watchtower on the edge of an invisible battlefield. Sometimes on quiet nights I can still hear it, a distant roar, a promise of vengeance. The creature is patient. It can wait, and so can I, because I know that someday, whether in my lifetime or not, it will find a way to break free. And when it does, someone needs to be ready. Someone needs to remember the terror in the woods, the hunger that never dies. Someone needs to stand guard against the long dark of the forest. Years have passed since that night in the clearing. I'm an old man now, my hair gone gray, my hands not as steady as they once were, but my eyes are still sharp, always watching the tree line, always alert for any sign that our precarious peace has been broken. The town has changed. New faces have replaced the old. People who know the stories of the creature in the woods only as local legend, campfire tales to scare tourists. But there are still those of us who remember, who know the truth that lurks behind the tall tales. Frank passed away a few winters back. John Rainwater moved to a reservation out west. Of the original group that faced the creature that night, I'm the last one left. The weight of our secret, of our vigil, rests heavy on my shoulders. I've tried to pass on what I know. I've trained a new generation of watchers, taught them the signs to look for, the rituals to maintain the barriers. Some listen out of respect for an old man eccentricities. A few, I think, truly believe. But will it be enough when the time comes? There have been incidents over the years. Hikers reporting strange sounds deep in the woods. Animals found mutilated in ways that don't match any known predator. And always, always that feeling of being watched when you venture too deep into the forest. The creature is testing its bonds, probing for weaknesses. It's patient, yes, but it's also cunning and hungry. Always hungry. I've documented everything I can, filled notebooks with details of our encounter, the ritual, the aftermath. I've mapped out the boundaries of its prison, noted every strange occurrence within. It's not much, but it's something to leave behind. A warning, a guide for those who come after. There are nights when I wake in a cold sweat. The memory of those inhuman eyes boring into me. I wonder if I did the right thing, all those years ago. Would it have been better to let the creature roam free, to let the world see the truth of what lurks in the shadows? Or have I merely postponed an inevitable reckoning? But then I look out my window at the peaceful town below, at families going about their lives without fear, and I know I made the right choice. We bought time. Time for the world to prepare, to grow stronger. Time for knowledge to spread, and defenses to be built. And yet I fear it won't be enough. The creature spoke of being eternal, and I believe it. Our binding spell is strong, but nothing lasts forever. Someday, whether in a year or a century, it will break free, and when it does, it will be angry, vengeful, and more powerful than ever. I've made arrangements for when I'm gone. The cabin will pass to someone who understands its true purpose. My notes will be preserved, distributed to those who need to know. The watch will continue. But as I sit here on my porch, looking out at the forest that has been both my home and my prison for so long, I can't shake the feeling that we're on the edge of something, a tipping point. The calm before a storm that's been brewing for decades. There's a change in the air. The birds have gone quiet. The wind carries that old familiar scent of decay. And sometimes, when the night is darkest, I swear I can hear a voice on the wind, a growl that forms words. Soon. I don't know if I'll be here to face it when it comes. Part of me hopes I won't be. But to whoever reads this, whoever takes up the watch after I'm gone, know this. The creature is real. It is ancient. It is patient. And it is coming. Stay vigilant. Stay strong. And whatever you do, don't forget the horror that waits in the heart of the forest. Because it certainly hasn't forgotten us. It happened on a crisp autumn morning, nearly 30 years after we bound the creature. I was in my 80s by then, my body frail, but my mind still sharp. I woke to the sound of sirens in the distance, a rarity in our small town. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I made my way to the porch, my old joints protesting every step. The air was thick with tension, and that familiar nauseating stench I hadn't smelled in decades. My heart sank. I knew what it meant before I even saw the plume of smoke rising from the forest. The creature had broken free. The town was in chaos. People were running, packing their cars, desperate to get away from whatever was coming. I stood there watching, a strange calm settling over me. I'd known this day would come. I'd prepared for it as best I could. I made my way to the sheriff's office, where a group had already gathered. The current sheriff, a young woman named Laura, was trying to maintain order. When she saw me, relief washed over her face. She was one of the few who believed the old stories, who understood the true nature of the threat we faced. "Mason," she said, her voice tight with worry. "It's happening, isn't it?" I nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. Where was it last seen?" She pointed to a map on the wall. Here, near the old Wilson property, we've got reports of bodies, torn apart, just like in your stories. I closed my eyes, seeing Jason's mangled form in my mind. It's angry, I said, and it's had a long time to plan its revenge. The next few hours were a blur of activity. We organized search parties, set up blockades, tried to evacuate as many people as we could, but we all knew it was futile. This creature wasn't something you could fight with guns and roadblocks. As night fell, the reports got worse. The creature was moving fast, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. It seemed to be heading straight for the town, straight for us. I found myself back at my cabin, gathering the old notes, the artifacts we'd used in the binding ritual so long ago. As I worked, I heard a noise outside, heavy breathing, the crunch of leaves under an enormous weight. I turned slowly, my old heart pounding, to see the creature standing in my doorway. It was larger than I remembered. Its form somehow more twisted, more wrong, but its eyes were the same, filled with that terrible intelligence, that ancient hunger. You, it growled, its voice like stones grinding together. You trapped me. I stood my ground, facing the nightmare that had haunted me for 3 decades. I did what I had to do, I said, to protect my home, my people. The creature laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. Your people, it mocked. They've forgotten, they've grown weak, but I have grown strong. It took a step forward, its massive claws leaving gouges in my wooden floor. I could kill you now, old man. But that would be too easy. No, I want you to watch, to see everything you fought to protect crumble and burn. I knew then what I had to do. The original binding hadn't worked, not permanently, but there was another way, a last resort, something I'd discovered in my years of research but had prayed I'd never have to use. You're right, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I am old, I've lived my life, but this ends now, one way or another. Before the creature could react, I threw a handful of powder into the air, a mixture of herbs and minerals I'd prepared for just this moment. I began to chant, the words feeling strange and ancient on my tongue. The creature roared in rage, lunging forward. But it was too late. The air around us began to shimmer and twist. I felt a pulling sensation as if my very essence was being stretched. What have you done? The creature bellowed, its form beginning to waver and distort. What I should have done years ago, I managed to say through gritted teeth. If I can't destroy you, I'll take you with me, away from here, away from everyone. The world around us began to fade, reality itself seeming to tear at the seams. The creature howled, a sound of fury and perhaps fear. I closed my eyes, feeling myself being pulled into somewhere else. The last thing I heard was the creature's voice, filled with a mix of rage and grudging respect. Well played, old man. But wherever we go, the hunt will continue. And then, nothing. Darkness, silence. I don't know where we are now. Some other plane of existence, perhaps. A realm between realms. All I know is that the creature is here with me, and as long as I can keep it occupied, as long as I can keep running, it can't hurt anyone else. To whoever finds this journal, if anyone ever does, the threat is gone, at least for now. But stay vigilant, for if there's one thing I've learned, it's that evil never truly dies. It just waits for its moment to return. And when it does, you must be ready. 20 years have passed since Mason Herford's disappearance. The town of Redacted in western Montana has changed, grown, but never quite forgotten the terror that once lurked in its forests. The younger generation might laugh off the stories as local folklore, but there's always an undercurrent of unease, a wariness that keeps people from venturing too deep into the woods after dark. Sheriff Laura Connor, now in her 50s, sits at her desk, poring over Mason's old journals for what must be the 100th time. She's made it her life's work to continue his vigil, to keep the town safe from threats both mundane and otherworldly. A knock at her door startles her from her reverie. It's Deputy Mark Tanner, fresh-faced and eager, reminding her so much of herself when she first took this job. "Sheriff," he says, a hint of excitement in his voice. "You need to see this." He hands her a report. Another animal attack. But something about this one is different. The claw marks are larger, the violence more extreme. And there's that smell the witnesses reported, like decay and something. Laura feels a chill run down her spine. She looks up at Mark, sees the fear and confusion in his eyes. He's too young to remember, but she knows. She remembers. "Get your gear," she says, standing up and grabbing her jacket. "We're going out there." As they drive towards the site, Laura can't shake the feeling that this is just the beginning. That somehow, some way, the horror has found its way back. She thinks of Mason, of his sacrifice, of the stories he told her, the warnings he gave. She remembers his final words, scrawled hastily in his journal before he vanished. Evil never truly dies. It just waits for its moment to return. And when it does, you must be ready. Laura tightens her grip on the steering wheel. She is ready. She has to be. Because if Mason couldn't end this for good, then it's up to her, up to all of them, to keep the watch, to stand guard against the long dark of the forest. As they pull up to the crime scene, the wind shifts, carrying with it a familiar putrid scent. Laura steps out of the car, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon. In the distance, something moves in the shadows of the trees. The hunt begins anew. As Laura and Deputy Mark approach the crime scene, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees loomed larger, their shadows deeper and more menacing than Laura remembered. The air grew thick with that sickly sweet odor of decay, bringing back memories she'd tried for years to suppress. "Sheriff," Mark called out, his voice tight with tension. "Over here." Laura made her way to where Mark stood, his flashlight beam illuminating a patch of ground that made her stomach churn. The earth was torn up, great furrows carved into the soil as if by massive claws, and there, half hidden in the undergrowth, was a body, or what was left of one. "Jesus," Mark whispered, turning away. Laura steeled herself and moved closer. The victim was unrecognizable, torn apart with a savagery that went beyond any natural predator. She'd seen this before in old photographs and nightmares. This was the work of the creature. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond their flashlight beams. Both officers spun around, weapons drawn. For a long moment there was only silence, broken by their ragged breathing and the distant call of an owl. Then they heard it, a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Laura felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She knew that sound. She'd heard Mason describe it countless times. "Mark," she said, keeping her voice low and steady. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. From the shadows burst a form so monstrous, so utterly wrong, that Laura's mind recoiled from the sight of it. It was the creature, exactly as Mason had described it, but somehow larger, more terrifying. Its eyes gleamed with malevolent intelligence as it regarded them. Mark fired, the sound of his gun deafening in the quiet forest. The creature jerked but didn't fall. Instead, it let out a roar that shook the trees and lunged forward. Laura pushed Mark out of the way, feeling the rush of air as the creature's claws barely missed them. They ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of the monster's pursuit close behind. As they ran, Laura's mind raced. How was this possible? Mason had sacrificed himself to take the creature away. Unless it had found a way back. Or worse, what if it had never truly left? They burst out of the tree line onto the road where their car was parked. Laura fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. Just as she got the door open, she heard Mark cry out. She turned to see the creature dragging Mark back into the darkness. Without thinking, she grabbed the flare gun from the glove compartment and fired. The forest lit up in a brilliant red glow, and for a moment she saw the creature in all its horrifying detail. It dropped Mark and recoiled from the light, disappearing back into the shadows with inhuman speed. Laura helped Mark to his feet. He was bleeding but alive. As they sped back to town, Laura's mind was reeling. The creature was back, or maybe it had never truly left. Either way, the nightmare wasn't over. It was starting all over again. In the days that followed, Laura threw herself into research. She pored over Mason's journals, reached out to contacts he'd mentioned, trying to piece together what had happened and how to stop it. Reports of attacks increased. The town was gripped by fear once again. Laura organized patrols, set up barriers, but deep down she knew it wouldn't be enough. They needed a more permanent solution. It was during one of her late-night research sessions that she found it, hidden in the margins of Mason's final journal entry, almost too faint to read. Coordinates and a cryptic message. The source. The key. where it all began. Laura knew then what she had to do. She gathered a team. Mark, now recovered, a local historian who'd helped Mason years ago, and a few others who believed. They prepared as best they could, knowing they were likely walking into death itself. The coordinates led them deep into the wilderness, to a part of the forest so ancient and untouched it felt like stepping back in time. And there, in a clearing that pulsed with an energy that made their skin crawl, they found it. A portal, a tear in reality itself, shimmering with otherworldly light. They could see shapes moving on the other side, hear whispers in languages no human throat could produce. And they understood. This was where the creature had come from. This was the source of the evil that had plagued their town for generations. As they stood there, the creature appeared. But it wasn't alone. Dozens of its kind emerged from the shadows, a horde of nightmares made flesh. Laura looked at her team, saw the fear in their eyes, but also the determination. They knew what was at stake. With a nod, they began the ritual they'd prepared, using knowledge gleaned from Mason's notes and their own desperate research. The air crackled with energy. The creatures howled in fury, charging forward. But it was too late. The portal began to close, sucking the monsters back to whatever hell they'd crawled out of. In the chaos, Laura locked eyes with the original creature, the one that had haunted her town for so long. In its gaze, she saw recognition, hatred, and perhaps a flicker of respect. Then it was gone, the portal snapping shut with a sound like thunder. The forest was quiet once more. Laura and her team stood in stunned silence, hardly daring to believe it was over. But Laura knew better. She'd learned from Mason's mistakes. This wasn't an end. It was a respite, a temporary victory in an eternal war. As they made their way back to town, Laura began to plan. They would set up a permanent watch, train others, prepare for the day when the evil would inevitably try to return. Because that was the truth Mason had discovered, the lesson written in blood and terror. The darkness never truly goes away. It just waits for its moment to return. And when it does, they would be ready. Years have passed since that fateful night in the ancient forest. The town of Redacted has changed, grown, evolved. To an outsider, it might seem like any other picturesque Montana community. Charming Main Street, friendly locals, breathtaking mountain views. But beneath the surface, there's a vigilance, a readiness that sets it apart. Laura Connor, now in her 70s, sits on the porch of the cabin that once belonged to Mason Herford. She's made it her home, her watchtower. The walls are lined with maps, charts, and notebooks filled with generations of knowledge about the darkness that once plagued their town. She's not alone in her vigil. Over the years, she's trained others. Mark Tanner, now the town sheriff. A group of trusted deputies, even some of the younger generation who showed an aptitude for sensing the otherworldly. They form a network, a thin line of defense against horrors most of the world doesn't even know exist. The portal remains closed, but they know it's not gone. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, they can feel it pulsing, like a malevolent heartbeat deep in the earth. And occasionally there are incidents. A hiker goes missing. An animal is found mutilated in ways that defy natural explanation. Each time Laura and her team investigate, always vigilant, always prepared for the worst. They've expanded their knowledge, reaching out to other communities, other watchers who guard against similar threats. They've learned that their town isn't unique, that all over the world, there are places where the veil between worlds is thin, where ancient evils lurk just out of sight. Laura looks out at the forest, remembering the terror that once ruled her life, the sacrifices made by Mason and countless others. She feels the weight of responsibility, but also a sense of purpose that has defined her existence. As the sun sets, casting long shadows across the land, Laura stands up, her old joints protesting, but her spirit still strong. She makes her way inside, checks the wards and protective symbols that guard the cabin, and sits down at her desk. She opens a journal, the latest in a long line stretching back to Mason's original notes, and begins to write. She documents the day's events, her observations, her fears, and her hopes. This record, she knows, may one day be all that stands between humanity and the darkness that waits to return. As she writes, Laura reflects on the nature of their struggle. It's not a war that can be won, not permanently. The darkness is patient, eternal. But so too, she realizes, is the light that stands against it. As long as there are people willing to stand guard, to keep watch, there's hope. The story of Redacted isn't over. It may never be over. But Laura and those who will come after her are ready. They are the Watchers, the Guardians, the thin line that stands between our world and the horrors that lurk beyond. And so the vigil continues. The eternal watch goes on. As the first light of dawn breaks over the Montana mountains, Laura sets down her pen. She closes the journal, running her weathered hands over its leather cover. This volume, like all the others before it, holds the weight of history, of battles fought in the shadows, of a vigil kept through generations. A soft knock at the door pulls her from her reverie. It's Amelia, her great-niece and chosen successor. At just 25, Amelia possesses a strength and wisdom beyond her years, tempered by an understanding of the gravity of the task that lies before her. "Come in," Laura calls, her voice still strong despite her years. Amelia enters, her eyes immediately scanning the room, taking in the maps, the symbols, the carefully organized shelves of journals and arcane texts. It's a habit Laura has instilled in her. Always be aware, always be prepared. "It's time, isn't it?" Amelia asks, her voice quiet but steady. Laura nods, a mix of sadness and pride in her eyes. "Yes, my dear. I'm not getting any younger, and the watch must go on." She stands, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. From it she retrieves a small wooden box, intricately carved with symbols of protection and power. Laura holds it for a moment, feeling its weight, not just physical but spiritual. "This contains everything you'll need," Laura explains, handing the box to Amelia. "The key to the wards, the map of the weak points, the rituals we've gathered over the years. But remember, the most important tools are your mind, your heart, and your will." Amelia takes the box, her hands trembling slightly, but her gaze unwavering. "I won't let you down, Aunt Laura. I won't let any of you down." Laura smiles, reaching out to cup Amelia's cheek. "I know you won't. You're stronger than I ever was, than Mason was. You were born for this." They spend the rest of the day going over final preparations. Laura shares her last pieces of wisdom, answers Amelia's remaining questions. As the sun begins to set, they step out onto the porch, looking out over the town and the forest beyond. "Remember," Laura says, her voice taking on a tone of formal ceremony, "you're not just protecting this town. You're guarding a boundary, a line between our world and forces we can barely comprehend. It's a heavy burden, but you don't carry it alone. The Watchers that came before us, they're with you in spirit, and there will be others to stand with you, to take up the watch when you're gone." Amelia nods, her posture straightening as she accepts the mantle of responsibility. "I'm ready," she says simply. As darkness falls, Laura feels a shift in the air. Not a threat, not the stirring of ancient evils, but a changing of the guard. The torch has been passed. She knows her time is coming to an end, but Laura feels at peace. She's done her part, kept the watch, and now she's ensured it will continue. In Amelia, and in the network of guardians they've built over the years, the fight goes on. The creatures from beyond may be eternal, patient in their hunger, but so too is the human spirit, the will to stand against the darkness. As long as there are those willing to keep watch, to guard the boundaries between worlds, there is hope. Laura takes one last look at the darkening forest, then turns to follow Amelia inside. The cabin, once Mason's sanctuary, now Amelia's watchtower, stands as a beacon against the encroaching night. The story of Redacted continues. The watch goes on, and in the balance between light and dark, in the eternal vigil kept by generations of guardians, the future of not just a town but of our world hangs in the balance. The end is just another beginning. The cycle continues. The watch remains eternal. As the years roll on, Amelia proves herself a worthy successor to Laura and all those who came before. The town of Redacted continues to thrive under her vigilant protection, its residents blissfully unaware of the dangers that lurk just beyond the veil of their reality. Amelia's network of watchers grows, spreading beyond the boundaries of their small Montana town. They connect with other guardians across the country, across the world, forming a web of protection against the dark forces that threaten to break through. There are close calls, nights when the old evil stirs, when the barrier between worlds grows thin, but each time Amelia and her team stand firm, armed with the knowledge passed down through generations and their own unwavering determination. And on quiet evenings, when the weight of her responsibility feels heaviest, Amelia sits on the porch of the old cabin. She looks out at the forest, feeling the presence of those who came before, Mason, Laura, and countless others whose names have been lost to time. Their strength flows through her, a reminder that she is but one link in an unbroken chain stretching back through history. In the town below, lights flicker on as night falls. Families gather for dinner, children play in yards, and life goes on, all possible because of the silent guardians who keep watch from the shadows. The evil may be eternal, but so is the watch, and as long as there are those willing to stand against the darkness, there will always be hope. The story of isn't over. It may never be over, but with each passing day, with each new guardian who takes up the mantle, the light grows stronger, and so the watch continues. Forever vigilant, forever unbroken.